We begin far from the battlefield in dim military infirmaries, where the smell of disinfectant mixed with blood, and where German medics quietly handed out small, white tablets meant to keep a collapsing army moving. They were called Eucodal, a synthetic opioid far stronger than morphine, and for thousands of Nazi soldiers, it became the unseen chain that kept them marching long after their bodies had given up. There was no dramatic announcement, no official order stamped with an eagle seal, just whispered recommendations from doctors, field surgeons, and exhausted officers. Give him one. He needs to keep fighting. The drug dulled pain, sharpened focus, and replaced fear with a cold, mechanical calm. In the push across Europe, many soldiers believed they were unstoppable, but the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. They were medicating their way through a war. They were no longer physically capable of fighting. The consequences came later. Tremors, hallucinations, withdrawal so severe some soldiers begged to be sent back into combat rather than face it. Yet, the supply continued, hidden inside logistics reports and mislabeled crates. Even as the Reich crumbled, the addiction it created remained a secret the regime never intended to explain. So tonight, dim the room and lean into the silence. Imagine the weight of a soldier's helmet, the sting of cold air, and the hollow calm of a pill meant to push a man past his breaking point. Subscribe and stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from, and remember the men who marched not by strength, but by chemicals that masked their pain. This was more than addiction. It was the quiet collapse of an army held together by a drug no one was meant to speak of. The story begins not with marching boots or roaring tanks, but with the soft rattle of glass bottles in a medic's satchel, before the first shots of a new offensive, before the cold or hunger or exhaustion pressed itself onto a soldier's spine. There was a quiet exchange behind canvas flaps. A surgeon, reaching into a pouch and pulling out a small, chalk-white tablet. It had no heroic name, no official decree, no propaganda poster announcing its role in the war. It was simply there, tucked into medical kits as casually as bandages or antiseptic. The soldiers called it many things. The strong one, the warm one, the one that makes you float. But its real name was Eucodal, a synthetic opioid far stronger than morphine and far more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. In the early years of the war, it was administered sparingly. A wounded infantryman in a frozen trench, a machine gun operator whose shoulder was torn by recoil, a driver whose hands trembled from shock after an explosion. The medics worked quickly, gloved fingers numbed by cold, the air thick with the smell of blood and wet wool. They spoke quietly, almost apologetically, as they placed the pill under a soldier's tongue. Within minutes, the man would breathe easier, the agony thinning into a warm, chemical fog. For officers, this was a mercy. For the men themselves, it felt like resurrection, the return of clarity, strength, and the illusion of control. But the pills didn't stay confined to emergencies. War has a way of normalizing what should never be normal. As the weeks turned into years, as attrition tore through ranks faster than reinforcements could arrive, the tablets made their way from medics' tents to barracks, to pockets, to frontline packs. Infantrymen, who had once taken a single dose after a severe wound, began asking for more, just to steady my hands, to sleep, to march through the cold, to stop thinking. Medics noticed, of course. They saw the shaking fingers, the restless nights, the hollowed eyes of men whose bodies had begun to depend on something stronger than discipline. But they also saw the casualty lists, the impossible orders, the pressure to keep units moving, fighting, advancing. In a war measured by kilometers gained and bodies lost, compassion became a luxury, and hesitation a liability. Quiet approvals came from above, not in writing, but in nods and silence. A battalion commander who saw his exhausted troops suddenly marching with renewed vigor didn't ask questions. A logistics officer who noticed an unusual number of medical crates marked pain treatment didn't request clarification. The Reich prided itself on iron discipline and superhuman endurance, yet behind the image of unstoppable soldiers was a chemical scaffold, holding them upright. By the time addiction began to weave itself into the rhythm of daily military life, it was too late to reverse course. The soldiers themselves rarely called it dependency. They said it helped them focus, helped them forget, helped them survive, and in a way, they were right. Eukodal gave them the strength to walk back into battles they had no strength left to fight, but every tablet taken pushed them further into a war inside their own bodies, a war without medals, without victories, and without escape. This is how the hidden crisis began. Not with orders from Berlin, but with a single pill in a single hand, passed quietly to a soldier desperate to feel whole for just a few more hours. The opioid had no name on the battlefield, but it would soon define the men who swallowed it. Before Eukodal ever reached the battlefield, its story began in a different kind of war, one fought in laboratories lit by dim, yellow bulbs, where Germany's leading pharmaceutical minds searched desperately for substances that could outmatch pain, fear, and exhaustion. In the years before the conflict erupted, the country was already carrying the scars of economic collapse, political humiliation, and a population struggling with chronic ailments. Morphine addiction haunted hospitals and homes alike. Doctors spoke of patients who could no longer function without injections. Newspapers whispered of overdoses. The Reich was rebuilding itself on every front. Industry, military, identity, and medicine was no exception. Into this environment stepped chemists determined to make something stronger, something more efficient, something that could be used without the stigma of morphine. In quiet meetings behind polished doors, researchers proposed a new generation of synthetic opioids, laboratory-crafted solutions to pain that were easier to manufacture and harder to trace. They spoke of breakthroughs, of progress, of German innovation leading the world. In truth, they were arming the nation with a drug that would one day reshape the human limits of warfare. Eukodal oxycodone emerged from this scientific push. On paper, it was a marvel. Faster onset than morphine, higher potency, a cleaner profile for medical use, or so they believed. It could be produced, at scale, controlled, packaged, and distributed with impressive efficiency. The German pharmaceutical industry, one of the most advanced in the world, lined up behind it willingly. Brochures advertised its benefits. Medical journals praised its potential. Doctors prescribed it with confidence. Yet, beneath the optimism lay a quiet desperation. Germany was preparing for a conflict it insisted it did not want, but inevitably marched toward. When rearmament began in secret, so did the parallel medical build-up. Supplies of Eukodal increased. Warehouses filled with crates, stamped with pharmaceutical logos. By the time the Wehrmacht expanded beyond anything Versailles had allowed, a silent reserve of synthetic opioids was already in place, enough to treat wounds, calm nerves, and, as would soon become clear, push soldiers beyond the breaking point. What made Eukodal so appealing to military planners wasn't simply its potency, it was its promise. A drug that could keep a wounded soldier fighting, a drug that could steady shaking hands, a drug that could mask suffering long enough to complete a mission. In a state obsessed with strength, sacrifice, and endurance, the idea of chemically reinforcing the human body was not perceived as unethical, it was viewed as necessary. When war finally erupted, the need for synthetic hope became immediate. The faster the front expanded, the more pressure landed on medics and field surgeons. They wrote letters, requesting more supplies. Headquarters responded with shipments that grew in volume month after month. No one asked how many tablets were being used. No one questioned why so many units reported identical requests. Addiction was not yet a recognized threat. Efficiency was. Germany's soldiers would soon enter Poland, France, and the vast expanse of the Eastern Front, with Eukodal stored quietly in their packs, in medical tents, in supply crates moving behind the lines. They had no idea that a drug perfected in the sterile calm of German laboratories would accompany them through fire, snow, hunger, and shock, giving strength when none remained, and taking far more than it ever gave back. In these early days, Eukodal was hailed as progress. It would take years and countless lives before the truth emerged. Synthetic hope had become a synthetic trap, waiting for the moment war pushed every soldier past the limits of flesh and will. War does not begin with glory. It begins with paperwork stacks of requisition forms, supply lists, casualty estimates, medical directives stamped with eagle crests and filed into endless grey cabinets. In these documents, the role of the military physician was defined in exacting detail. To preserve fighting strength, to return the wounded to the field as quickly as possible, and to ensure that the army, above all else, remained operational. It was a mandate that left little room for ethics, hesitation, or second thoughts. When the war finally expanded across Europe, the expectations placed upon German doctors became nearly impossible to meet. The early months of the conflict overwhelmed them. Field hospitals filled faster than supplies could arrive. Wounded men lay on stretchers in muddy corridors, waiting for treatment as surgeons worked with numb hands under dim lanterns. Men cried out for relief, for rest, for anything that would stop the burning, stabbing, grinding pain that seemed to define the modern battlefield. The doctors knew morphine. They had been trained on its effects, but they also knew its limits. Morphine dulled suffering. It did not restore a soldier's ability to fight. Eukodal, however, seemed to offer something different. At first, physicians used it sparingly, cautiously, following the guidelines sent from Berlin. But those guidelines had been written for civilian hospitals, not for the churn of mechanized war. In the field, necessity blurred the lines. A soldier, still bleeding from shrapnel, might need to march another 10 kilometers to rejoin his unit. A machine gunner with a fractured rib couldn't simply be evacuated, not when his battalion held a critical ridge. A tank crewman, trembling from concussion, might be required to climb back into the turret before dawn. And each time a doctor hesitated, each time he saw a unit losing momentum, Eukodal became the temporary solution. The shift was subtle. A medic gave a tablet to a soldier who insisted he could push on. A surgeon offered a dose to calm a man shaking uncontrollably after artillery fire. An officer requested that his best men receive support before a difficult assault. The doctors understood what was happening, that the drug was no longer treating wounds but buying performance. Yet they also understood the unspoken rule. A functional soldier was worth more than a healthy one. Some physicians resisted. They wrote in their journals of unease, of moral conflict, of men returning for pills with desperation in their eyes. They knew the signs of dependency, but reporting it would mean grounding entire squads, delaying operations, or contradicting the expectations of commanders who believed chemistry could hold an army together. Others rationalized their actions. They told themselves the war would be short, that the doses were small, that they were protecting their patients from worse fates. And some, exhausted, overwhelmed, and numbed by the relentless pace of the fighting, simply stopped asking questions. The hierarchy made it easy to look away. Officially, no addiction crisis existed. No policy acknowledged the risks. No commander publicly questioned the rising shipments of synthetic opioids flowing to the front. Doctors who attempted to raise concerns found their reports buried, ignored, or quietly dismissed as matters beyond their responsibility. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the edges of the Soviet Union, many physicians knew the truth. They were not just treating soldiers. They were sustaining a system built on chemical endurance. And though they recognized the consequences, trembling hands, hollow stares, unpredictable behavior, they continued their work, convincing themselves that tomorrow's battles demanded it. In the end, the doctors did not choose addiction for their men. They chose survival, efficiency, and obedience, and the quiet, looking away that made all three possible. The first stories spread through the ranks like whispered legends, tales of men who should have been carried off the field on stretchers but instead stood up, tightened their belts, and walked back into the fight. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were mechanics, riflemen, drivers, machine gunners, ordinary soldiers whose bodies had been torn, frozen, or crushed under the weight of battle. Yet their sudden returns to duty were spoken of with awe, as if they possessed a willpower that defied the limits of flesh. But the truth behind these miracles began in the medic's tent. One of the earliest accounts came from a battered infantry company retreating under heavy shelling. A young private had taken shrapnel to the thigh, not fatal, but enough to send him into shock. His leg trembled uncontrollably, blood pooling beneath him as stretcher-bearers struggled to keep him conscious. In the chaos, a medic reached for a small, white tablet Eucodal. Within minutes, the private's eyes steadied. He stopped shaking. The pain that had consumed him softened into something distant and muted. Against every regulation and every logical order, he pushed himself upright, insisting he could still fight. The men around him watched, astonished, as he limped back toward his unit. It was a strange, unsettling sight, a wounded soldier returning to the front instead of being carried away from it. Commanders interpreted it as resilience, a testament to German grit. Medics knew better. They had seen the transformation, the sudden calm, the renewed focus, the eerie sense of detachment, but they said nothing. In war, results mattered more than explanations. Soon, more stories emerged. A machine gunner with cracked ribs who managed to haul his weapon back to the trench line after a dose. A scout with a mangled hand who continued a night mission as if pain were merely an inconvenience. A tank loader who'd been partially deafened by an explosion but returned to his crew within the hour, claiming he felt clear again. Each incident was recorded in unit diaries, noted in after-action reports, passed along through mess halls and smoky barracks. Soldiers spoke of them with admiration, as if the men involved possessed some hidden reservoir of strength. Officers, on the other hand, saw utility. If a pill could return a fighting man to the line faster, then it had value, strategic value. The term miracle recovery started appearing in internal communications. It was never officially attributed to Eucodal, but every doctor and medic understood the connection. Some were uneasy. The speed at which the drug took hold, the way it masked injuries without healing them, the strange calm it produced, it all felt wrong. Yet the demands of the war left little room for hesitation. When a division needed bodies for an advance, when reinforcements failed to arrive, when losses mounted beyond replacement, those miracles became necessary. And for a time, the system worked. Men who should have been incapacitated kept moving. Units maintained momentum. Commanders boasted of their soldiers' endurance. But beneath every miracle lay a quiet truth. The pain had not vanished. It had only been hidden. The bodies had not healed. They had simply been pushed past their natural limits. And the men themselves, though praised, celebrated, and sometimes decorated, were paying a price no one wanted to calculate. These early cases set a precedent. What began as an emergency measure became a tool. What was once a medical decision became an unspoken strategy, and the soldiers who returned to the front under the drug's influence were hailed not as victims of chemical manipulation, but as examples of German will living proof, commanders said, that the Reich produced warriors capable of anything. The reality was far simpler and far darker. The first miracles were not triumphs of human strength. They were warnings the army chose to ignore. Endurance was not a luxury in the Wehrmacht. It was a requirement. The pace of the early campaigns, Poland, France, the Low Countries, demanded movements so relentless that even the strongest bodies faltered under its strain. Soldiers were expected to march for hours through mud, rubble, and forests, often with little food, little rest, and little warning. A man's muscles could ache, his lungs could burn, his vision could blur, but the expectations remained unchanged. Advance, hold, move again. In this environment, Eucodal found its place. Unlike stimulants such as Pervitin, which heightened alertness and pushed soldiers into a feverish drive, Eucodal worked quietly. It did not speed the heart or cloud the senses with manic energy. Instead, it stripped away the barrier that stopped a man from pushing forward pain. With pain removed, exhaustion became less oppressive, injuries less debilitating, and fear less sharp. The drug created a cold, steady state of endurance that commanders saw as invaluable. An infantryman might march 20 kilometers on blistered feet without wincing. A radio operator whose back was strained from carrying equipment could remain hunched over his device for hours more. A sentry who had stood in rain-soaked trenches for 3 nights might suppress the ache long enough to remain vigilant for one more shift. Slowly, quietly, Eucodal became woven into the rhythm of wartime endurance, invisible, unacknowledged, but undeniably effective. Medics noticed the change first. Soldiers who normally groaned with every movement suddenly stood straighter after a dose. Those prone to resting between maneuvers remained on their feet. Men who should have been sent to recovery tents instead insisted they were fine, their pain swallowed beneath a chemical surface. At first, the results seemed promising: fewer evacuations, fewer complaints, fewer delays. But beneath the efficiency, something unsettling began to appear. The drug did not restore energy. It only suppressed the body's warning signals. A man who took Eucodal might feel capable of marching another hour, but his muscles still tore under the strain. His bones still ground against each other. His wounds still bled. The cost was hidden until it was too late. Reports slowly surfaced of soldiers collapsing without warning on routine marches. Others suffered complications from untreated injuries that had been masked for days. A few simply fell unconscious in the middle of maneuvers, their bodies finally demanding repayment for what the drug had muted. Behind closed doors, doctors acknowledged the problem Eucodal gave endurance, but it did not give resilience. It only made men act resilient. Yet in wartime, acting resilient was often enough. Commanders rarely questioned why a battalion's performance surged after a visit from the medical unit. They did not ask why soldiers with cracked ribs were still carrying machine guns, or why men with shrapnel still lodged in their legs were fit for duty. They saw only results: faster advances, fewer withdrawals, and a fighting force that could do more than seemed humanly possible. Eucodal became, in effect, an unspoken component of the war machine, as essential as fuel, ammunition, or rations. It supplied a form of endurance that no training regimen or motivational speech could produce. It allowed men to endure the unendurable, to function when their bodies begged for rest, to push through the agony of cold, hunger, and fatigue. But endurance bought with chemicals comes with a price. As the war expanded, the demands on the German soldier grew heavier, and the quiet dependence on the drug deepened. The army believed it had found a tool to strengthen its ranks. In truth, it had created a crutch, one that would eventually crack under the weight of a conflict. Too vast, too brutal, and too dependent on borrowed strength, Eucodal was built for endurance. But it would soon become clear that no drug, no matter how powerful, could sustain an army forever. Officially, no document from Berlin ever declared that German soldiers should rely on synthetic opioids. There was no signature from Hitler, no directive from the General Staff, no stamped order from the Ministry of War authorizing widespread use. On paper, Eucodal remained a medical tool, a controlled substance reserved for severe injuries, administered only when absolutely necessary. But war is never lived on paper. It is lived in trenches, in frozen forests, in dimly lit medical tents, where the rules bend beneath the weight of survival. And in that lived reality, silence became approval. It began subtly, almost invisibly. Field surgeons wrote reports requesting resupplies of painkillers at a frequency that far exceeded peacetime medical norms. Logistics officers forwarded the requests up the chain with cautious notes. Regional medical commands acknowledged the numbers, but offered no objections. The Ministry of Supply, already stretched thin, redirected more shipments to the front. No questions asked, no corrections issued. The shipments grew larger, By the time the Wehrmacht was deep into its western campaigns, medical crates marked analgesics were being delivered by the thousands. Inside them, Eucodal sat nestled among bandages and disinfectants, unremarkable in appearance, untraceable in accountability. Commanders noticed the effects in their men. Fewer complaints, fewer evacuations, fewer delays. Men returned to duty quickly, sometimes too quickly, and the machine of war turned with renewed smoothness. And yet, no one in authority acknowledged the shift. High-ranking officers were not ignorant. They read casualty reports, behavioral notes, and the subtle warnings tucked into medical logs. They heard whispers from the front about soldiers who fought through injuries that should have incapacitated them, or whose calm under fire felt unnatural. But as long as the units performed, as long as the offensives succeeded, concerns remained unspoken. The Reich valued results, not questions, and results were precisely what the drug delivered. For the physicians closest to the front, the silence from above spoke volumes. When a division's medical officer mentioned recurring dependency symptoms in his monthly briefing, his superior merely nodded and urged him to prioritize operational readiness. When another requested guidelines for limiting doses, the response came weeks later, vague and non-committal. When a surgeon suggested monitoring long-term effects, his proposal was quietly shelved. The message was unmistakable. The drug was too useful to restrict. Far from Berlin, in the mud and ruin of active combat zones, field commanders adapted quickly. Some even incorporated the drug into unofficial strategy. One battalion commander instructed his medics to support key men before major assaults. A tank regiment administered doses to loaders struggling with fatigue during long operations. A reconnaissance company used it to keep scouts alert during extended night missions. None of this was authorized, but none of it was punished. Berlin's silence didn't just permit the drug's use, it encouraged it. As the war deepened and supply lines grew strained, the tacit approval continued. When shipments of Eucodal arrived late, officers complained bitterly, not because the wounded needed relief, but because their units could not maintain momentum without it. When medical personnel rationed pills responsibly, they were pressured to increase distribution. When doctors tried to classify cases of dependency, they were told such diagnoses were not militarily beneficial. In a state obsessed with strength, this silence was strategic. Admitting reliance on opioids would have undermined the myth of the superhuman German soldier. Acknowledging addiction would have stained the image of discipline. Recognizing dependency would have forced the Reich to confront the unsustainable nature of its own ambitions. Instead, the leadership allowed the drug to seep into the army's bloodstream unchecked. It became the quiet foundation beneath Germany's early war, successes invisible, unrecorded, but undeniably present. And as long as the soldiers marched, fought, and bled without complaint, the regime saw no need to intervene. But silence cannot hold forever. The longer Berlin refused to speak, the deeper the crisis embedded itself into the very core of the German military, setting the stage for consequences no one would be willing to acknowledge until the war was already lost. The dividing line between relief and control is thin in any war, but in the Wehrmacht, under the weight of endless campaigns and strategic overreach, that line eventually disappeared. What began as medical necessity slowly morphed into a means of shaping behavior, a way to keep soldiers functional, obedient, and silent. The German army prided itself on discipline and resolve, yet behind the facade of iron willpower was a growing dependence on a drug that dulled more than just pain. In the early stages of the war, doctors justified each tablet by pointing to necessity. A soldier with a wound that needed calming, a man shaking after shell shock, a stretcher-bearer whose nerves were frayed from carrying the injured through artillery fire. In these moments, Eucodal was a form of mercy. It softened agony, steadied trembling hands, and offered enough calm to keep a man from falling apart. But as casualties mounted and offensives extended beyond what planners imagined, the drug's purpose began to shift. Medics noticed that soldiers who received Eucodal often became obedient, almost unnervingly so. They followed orders without hesitation, even when those orders seemed unreasonable. Men who had previously voiced concerns or resisted returning to the line now complied with quiet, emotionless acceptance. Commanders saw this change and did not question it. Instead, they saw a solution to a growing problem: exhaustion, demoralization, and fear. The war demanded constant movement, pushing into forests, digging trenches, marching through snow, crossing rivers under fire. No army, not even one built on ideology and discipline, could sustain such demands without breaking. But a chemically softened soldier, one insulated from pain and dread, could be guided, like a tool. Over time, Eucodal became less about treating injuries and more about ensuring compliance. Reports surfaced of units being issued doses before major assaults, not because they were wounded, but because the attack required unwavering focus. Some companies recorded a marked improvement in battle readiness after distributions. Officers praised their men for their remarkable calm under fire, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that chemistry, not courage, was shaping their reactions. Even in moments far from battle, the drug played a role. When soldiers grew restless, arguing with superiors or expressing doubts, a medic might intervene with a dose for nerves. When a man was too exhausted to continue a march, Eucodal transformed him into someone who no longer noticed the pain. When a soldier questioned the point of a hopeless defense, he was sometimes given a tablet and told he would feel better soon. These small interventions built a system of chemical control. The men themselves rarely recognized the shift. They believed the drug helped them remain strong, that it restored their former selves. In truth, it made them quieter, more compliant, more manageable. It blunted not only physical agony but emotional resistance, smoothing over fear, doubt, and even moral hesitation. A soldier, insulated from suffering by opioids, could be pushed further, faster, and with fewer complaints. For the officers and bureaucrats managing a war that was spiraling toward overextension, this was an unspoken blessing. But for the soldiers, it was a trap. Pain exists to warn the body. Fear exists to protect it. Doubt exists to anchor judgment. Without these signals, a man becomes vulnerable to decisions made by others, decisions that often demanded more than his flesh and mind were capable of enduring. By the time the army recognized the consequences, dependency had already taken root. Soldiers who had been molded by painkillers could not function without them. The drug that once seemed like a tool of relief now revealed itself as a tool of control, one that held entire units together on the surface while eroding them from within. The Reich had not only hidden a drug crisis, it had weaponized it, turning the management of pain into a mechanism for sustaining a war that should have broken long before addiction took hold. Long before Eucodal appeared on casualty reports or filtered into medical statistics, it lived quietly in the barracks, tucked into coat pockets, wrapped in cloth bundles, shared in whispers between bunkmates who trusted each other with more than their lives. The barracks were the true pulse of the army, the place where men shed the stiffness of parade ground posture and revealed their exhaustion, their doubts, and their pain. And it was here, in the dim light of lanterns and the scent of damp wool, that the drug spread in ways no directive could ever track. At first, it began with injured men returning from field hospitals. A soldier who had been stitched up and sent back into service carried with him a small envelope containing a few leftover tablets for emergencies. They were meant to last only a day or two, but the men quickly learned that emergencies in war were not rare, they were constant. When the pain from a wound flared, he took a pill. When the nights grew unbearably cold and his body stiffened, he took another. When orders came to march before dawn and his legs felt like lead, he swallowed one more. Other soldiers noticed the changes. The man seemed calmer, more focused, able to push himself longer than before. They asked what he had taken. He shrugged, produced a tablet, and said it helped. That was enough. In the barracks, trust was built on shared suffering. and men were willing to rely on anything that promised relief. Soon, the informal barter system began. A pill traded for a pair of warm socks. A pill given to a man who couldn't sleep after the artillery bombardment. 2 pills accepted by a soldier terrified of an upcoming reconnaissance patrol. Medics had little control over this exchange. Once tablets left their hands, they entered a world of shared misery, camaraderie, and desperation that no medical regulation could penetrate. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs of someone carrying Eucodal. The subtle confidence, the steady hands, the softened grimace after a long march. Some men became informal, sources, hoarding pills from their visits to dressing stations and distributing them to friends in need. The culture of sharing was not driven by recklessness but by survival. War pushed every man to the brink. Those who found temporary relief felt compelled to help the man next to them, because tomorrow they might be the one begging for strength. But there was another side to this underground network: dependency. Soldiers began taking Eucodal for reasons that had nothing to do with pain. A man anxious about an upcoming assault took a tablet to steady his nerves. Another swallowed one to calm the tremor in his hand before he cleaned his rifle. A third took it simply because he felt he couldn't function without it. The barracks, once a place of crude laughter and exhausted camaraderie, slowly changed. Conversations grew quieter, eyes grew hollow, sleep became shallow and restless. Some men tried to stop. They hid their need, gritting their teeth through withdrawal, the sweating, shaking, the nausea. But stopping in the middle of a war was nearly impossible. There was no rest period, no rehabilitation, no time to recover. The machine demanded constant presence, constant readiness, constant strength, and so the sharing continued. By the time officers noticed the strange calm many soldiers carried with them, the drug culture was already deeply rooted. They attributed this calm to discipline, to training, to German stoicism. Few imagined it came from white tablets, passed between bunks in the dim hours before dawn. The barracks had become laboratories of their own places, where chemistry quietly reshaped the minds and bodies of frontline soldiers without a single official order. What spread there was not just a drug, but a belief that survival required more than courage or endurance. It required something chemical, something powerful, something that dulled the edges of a reality too sharp to face unassisted. In the shadows of the barracks, the hidden drug crisis grew unnoticed, unregulated, and unstoppable. Long before Eucodal reached the lips of exhausted soldiers, it travelled through a vast, intricate web of supply routes designed to keep the German war machine alive. These were the veins of the Reich rail lines, motor convoys, river barges, and medical depots, stretching from Berlin's industrial heart to the farthest frontline foxholes. Hidden among ammunition crates, fuel drums, and rations were smaller boxes, easily overlooked, marked simply as medical supplies. Inside them lay the tablets that would become silent companions to countless soldiers pushing past their limits. The secrecy was not the product of conspiracy, it was the consequence of bureaucracy. Medical shipments were classified broadly, with little distinction made between disinfectants, bandages, morphine, or synthetic opioids. The Army's procurement offices focused on volume, not specificity. As long as the crates met weight and inventory expectations, no one looked too closely. This allowed thousands of vials and packets of Eucodal to flow through the system unnoticed, uninterrupted, and unquestioned. Rail depots in central Germany were the first major hubs. Workers loading cargo rarely knew what they were handling. Labels mattered less than speed. Trains leaving for the east carried everything from artillery shells to blankets, and somewhere among them were the white bottles that fed the dependency forming on the front. When medical officers at the depots filled requisition orders, they often marked Eucodal under standard pain management, a category so routine that few glanced at it twice. From the rail lines, shipments were transferred onto military trucks. These convoys, rattling over uneven roads and through villages scarred by war, were the lifeline of entire divisions. Drivers were trained to protect fuel and ammunition above all else, and so the medical crates rode beneath tarps or tucked between burlap sacks. If a convoy was attacked, the priority was always the same: save the explosives, save the fuel. The smaller packages were left to fate. Many were lost this way, burned, looted, destroyed, but enough made it through to ensure a steady flow of opioids arrived where they were needed most. At forward medical stations, the crates were opened with mechanical efficiency. Doctors checked inventories, while orderlies stacked supplies in cramped rooms filled with the smell of alcohol and stale air. Eucodal often appeared in numbers that seemed excessive, but no one questioned it. The volume of casualties justified nearly any stockpile, and with no official guidelines capping usage, the tablets were dispensed at the discretion of medics overwhelmed by the endless parade of wounded and weary men. Some officers, noticing the unusual consistency of medical resupply, began quietly exploiting the system. They requested larger quantities, claiming outbreaks of illness or surges in combat injuries. Since Central Command rarely verified their claims, these requests were approved. The extra boxes were absorbed into the unofficial networks formed in barracks and command posts, feeding an addiction pipeline that operated beneath the surface of military order. Even when supply lines tightened, when fuel shortages, crippled convoys, or Russian counteroffensives severed rail lines, Eucodal still found its way forward. The drug was light, compact, and easily stored. A single medic could carry weeks' worth in a satchel. Officers protected it, not because they understood its addictive nature, but because they saw how it kept their men functional. When ammunition was scarce, when food ran low, when morale collapsed under winter skies, a tablet could make a soldier stand again. The most remarkable part of this hidden logistics system was how unintentional it was. No grand design placed Eucodal into the bloodstream of the German army. No mastermind scripted its journey from laboratory to battlefield. It moved because war demanded painkillers, because bureaucracy masked its quantity, and because commanders prioritized performance over wellness. Yet its presence in the supply lines shaped the war as deeply as fuel or food. It allowed offensives to continue past exhaustion, kept soldiers marching long after their bodies had failed, and created a dependence that would haunt the army long after the shipments stopped coming. Invisible, uncounted, and unregulated, the supply lines fed a crisis the Reich never intended to create, and one it had no capacity to control. Long before the first German soldier swallowed a Eucodal tablet on the battlefield, addiction was already woven into the social fabric of the Reich. The nation that marched into war in 1939 did so with a silent burden. An opioid crisis that had been growing beneath the surface. For decades, it was not spoken of in political speeches or celebrated in propaganda posters. It lived in pharmacies, in quiet hospital corridors, in middle-class households where pain was treated with chemicals stronger than anyone understood. Germany entered the war not as a clean slate, but as a country primed for dependency. The roots stretched back to the First World War. Millions of veterans returned home with shattered bodies and minds, many of them reliant on morphine to dull the agony of their injuries. Hospitals struggled to wean them off the drug. Some never succeeded. Entire families grew accustomed to the sight of morphine vials on bedside tables. For many, dependency became as common as the scars they carried. As the Weimar Republic stumbled through economic collapse and political turmoil, pharmaceutical companies flourished, offering new remedies to soothe a population drowning in hardship. By the time Hitler rose to power, addiction had become a national shadow, not a crisis in name, but a quiet, pervasive reality. The German pharmaceutical industry, among the most advanced in the world, continued to develop new painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants. Doctors prescribed them liberally, believing synthetic drugs represented the cutting edge of modern medicine. Pharmacies displayed bottles promising energy, calm, and relief. Many households stocked their cabinets with tablets to steady nerves or suppress pain. And then came Eucodal, marketed not just as a treatment, but as an improvement over morphine. Its creators touted it as less addictive, more effective, easier on the body. The claims were speculative at best, deceptive at worst, but they were accepted eagerly. Patients embraced the new medication. Doctors used it whenever they needed something stronger. Even before the Wehrmacht marched into Poland, Eukodal had already begun to carve its place in German life. When war erupted, this medical culture carried over seamlessly into the military. The soldiers were not strangers to pharmaceuticals. Many had taken opioids or sedatives in civilian life. For some, their first encounter with Eukodal in the field felt familiar, a return to something they had relied on before. Military physicians, trained in the same system that had normalized opioid use for decades, saw no immediate danger. If the drug worked, if it dulled the pain and kept men moving, it was deemed acceptable. The regime itself, obsessed with strength and productivity, unintentionally worsened the problem. Civilian workers in key industries were quietly encouraged to use stimulants and painkillers to keep up with production demands. Housewives, burdened by shortages and long labor hours, turned to over-the-counter sedatives. Even party officials, exhausted by endless meetings and political pressure, used pharmaceuticals to maintain performance. The addiction was not restricted to any class or occupation. It cut across the entire society. Thus, when Eukodal entered the bloodstream of the army, it encountered neither suspicion nor restraint. It fit into a pattern already established, a nation treating pain with chemistry, anxiety with pills, exhaustion with stimulants. The soldiers who reached for the tablets were not deviating from normal behavior. They were continuing a national habit. In the end, the hidden crisis within the Wehrmacht was not an isolated phenomenon. It was an extension of something much larger, a society accustomed to numbing itself, a culture that embraced pharmaceutical solutions, and a government that valued efficiency over well-being. Germany marched to war already weakened by dependency, not visibly, not in ways that propaganda could display, but in the quiet, chemical undercurrent that flowed through its people. The opioid crisis in the military did not begin at the front lines. It began at home, years before the first shot was fired. Sleep was the first casualty long before the bullets and shrapnel began claiming bodies. For the German infantrymen, rest became a distant memory, something spoken of but rarely experienced. The endless marches, sudden night assaults, bitter cold, and constant artillery threatened more than morale. They stripped the mind of stability, leaving soldiers drifting between wakefulness and exhaustion. In this fragile state, where a man's thoughts blurred and his nerves trembled from fatigue, Eukodal found fertile ground. The earliest reports spoke of companies who had gone nearly 48 hours without meaningful rest. Men staggered as they marched, their heads dipping, their boots dragging through mud. When they halted, their hands shook from exhaustion as they tried to open ration tins. Even when a unit was granted the rare opportunity to sleep, the environment betrayed them. Mortar blasts, enemy probing attacks, shivering cold, and memories of recent horrors pulled them back from the edge of rest. A soldier might drift off for minutes, then jolt awake at the sound of a snapping twig or distant engine. No one truly slept. They only collapsed and hoped. Unconsciousness would come quickly. Medics recognized the signs: hollow eyes, sunken faces, tremors visible even in the firelight. They offered the usual advice: rest when possible, drink water, lie still. But advice meant little in a war structured around movement, where units were pushed forward to maintain momentum, often at speeds faster than their bodies could withstand. Eventually, when sleeplessness turned into delirium, when a man's gaze lost focus and his speech slurred, the medics reached for the tablets that had become their quiet remedy. Eukodal did not induce sleep. It couldn't force a man into slumber. Instead, it dulled the frantic edge of exhaustion, removing the sharpness of discomfort and replacing it with a numb, calm clarity. Soldiers described it as feeling like sleep without sleeping. Their bodies still functioned, but their minds drifted, detached from the crushing weight of fatigue. They could march without stumbling, hold a rifle steady, maintain their bearings. It was the closest thing to rest many of them would experience for days. Soon, word spread. Soldiers asked for the tablets not because they were injured, but because they could no longer trust their minds. They feared the hallucinations that came with sleep deprivation, the shadows that seemed to move in the fields, the imagined whispers in ruined farmhouses, the flicker of enemy figures that evaporated when approached. They feared the moment when a lapse in attention would cost them their lives. Eucodal gave them a fragile sense of balance, a temporary anchor to reality. But as the drug spread, the side effects deepened. Men began to confuse numbness with recovery. They mistook a quiet mind for a rested one. Officers praised units that remained alert, despite impossible conditions, attributing their resilience to discipline rather than chemicals. In truth, these soldiers were running on borrowed strength, their bodies screaming silently beneath the drug's surface. Some infantrymen developed routines around their dependency. Before night marches, they took a tablet. Before standing sentry, they took another. When artillery lit the sky at midnight and robbed them of their one chance at sleep, they relied on the drug to steady their hands. The tablets became part of their equipment, as essential as ammunition or water. They were shared between bunkmates who understood each other's breaking points without needing to speak. By the time officers realized their troops were operating on chemical endurance, it was too late. Entire companies had adapted to life without real sleep. Their nervous systems stretched thin by a cycle of exhaustion softened only by opioids. They still marched, still fought, still obeyed, but beneath the rigid discipline was a fragile, chemically supported shell of what a soldier was supposed to be. The infantry did not stop sleeping because they were brave. They stopped sleeping because the war gave them no choice, and the drugs allowed them to continue long after their minds should have collapsed. In the trenches, numbness was not simply a symptom, it became a way of life. The front lines were a surreal blend of monotony and terror, a place where men waited in mud that never dried and air that never cleared. Shells screamed overhead without warning, rifles cracked in the fog, rats gnawed at boots and bodies alike. Under these conditions, the human senses dulled naturally over time, but with Eucodal in the mix, numbness took on a different, more haunting form. Trench life was already engineered to erode a man's emotional and physical boundaries. Days blurred together without distinction. Soldiers lived inches from death, yet had to remain steady enough to fire, reload, and obey orders. In this environment, pain wasn't merely a sensation, it was a constant companion. Back pain from crouching in narrow firing slits, infections from wet clothing, frostbite in winter, burns from exploding shells. The body was in revolt every hour. So when medics began administering Eucodal to ease pain, the drug's effects blended seamlessly into the ambient numbness of trench warfare. A soldier patched up after shrapnel wounds would feel his agony melt into a distant, muffled pressure. A man whose feet were swollen and bleeding from trench foot could stand again, walking as though the nerves had been switched off. Even emotional shock, the sight of a friend killed instantly beside him. The sickening dread of imminent assault became muted, dulled beneath. The chemical fog, the officers called it steadiness. They wrote in their reports that Eucodal helped maintain morale, reduced panic under fire, and kept units functioning despite relentless conditions. In reality, it erased the alarms that should have warned men they were reaching their breaking points, alarms meant to protect, not hinder. Some soldiers described the experience as floating. The mud felt less heavy. The cold seemed less biting. Even the thunder of artillery drifted through their minds like distant thunder instead of a terrifying message of death. They still fired their rifles, still held the line, but their reactions became slower, their senses dulled by a chemical haze that made the world seem unreal. This detachment came at a cost. Men missed critical cues on the battlefield, the shift in enemy fire patterns, the movement of shadows indicating an incoming flanking attack. Others failed to notice their own worsening injuries. A corporal once marched an entire day with a fractured ankle, unaware of the damage he inflicted with every step. Another soldier only realized he had been shot when he noticed blood dripping into the trench water below him. The psychological numbness was worse. Grief, fear, and horror, once overwhelming, now receded into a dull ache many mistook for resilience. A man who would have broken down days earlier suddenly appeared calm, quiet, and compliant. His comrades praised him for his strength. But when the drug wore off, the suppressed emotions surged like a flood, leaving him shaking, gasping, or begging for another dose. The trenches became a quiet reservoir of addiction. Soldiers learned to recognize when a man had taken Eukodal: the unfocused gaze, the steady hands, the unblinking stare even, as artillery rained down. They also learned to hide their own dependency. Asking for too many doses drew suspicion, so they traded with each other, rationed their limited supply, or pleaded with medics who were too overwhelmed to keep track. By dusk, the numbness had become its own ritual. Before night duty, before a raid, before sitting in silence waiting for death to arrive from the fog, many soldiers reached for the same small tablet that allowed them to feel nothing at all. In the trenches of the Eastern Front, pain was inevitable, but feeling nothing became the most dangerous state of all. Close combat was the most intimate kind of killing, a violent collision of bodies, breath, and desperation. It stripped warfare of distance and forced men to confront each other at arm's length. In the forests of the East, the ruins of French towns, and the shattered suburbs of Stalingrad, German soldiers found themselves locked in battles where rifles became clubs, bayonets became claws, and survival depended on split-second decisions made under crushing fear. Yet something began to change as Eukodal seeped deeper into the bloodstream of the Wehrmacht. What had once terrified men, the chaos, the blood, the screams, began to feel muted, almost distant. Commanders first noticed it in the aftermath of house-to-house fighting. Reports described soldiers who moved with eerie composure through narrow stairwells filled with smoke and plaster dust. They advanced without hesitation, clearing rooms with a precision that belied the terror around them. Witnesses recalled men who should have been trembling from shock, instead stepping over bodies with mechanical steadiness. Officers praised their courage, attributing it to discipline and iron training. The truth was more complicated. Eukodal didn't make men fearless, it disconnected them from the fear. It blunted the surge of panic that came when two soldiers collided in a dark doorway. It muffled the instinctive recoil from blood spray or the guttural cries of the wounded. A man who felt no pain, whose heart no longer raced with terror, could take actions that a sober soldier might resist or hesitate to carry out. In hand-to-hand engagements, this detachment turned lethal. During the winter, fighting near Leningrad, one NCO noted that a small group of infantry held their ground against a Soviet assault far longer than should have been possible. When reinforcements arrived, they found the men standing amid the aftermath, their faces blank, their knuckles bloodied, their movements steady. Later, during medical checks, several were discovered to have taken Eukodal hours earlier, originally for exhaustion, but now woven into the chaos of close-quarters combat. The pattern repeated across fronts. Men who were dosed before major offensives showed decreased fear responses, slower emotional reactions, and a chilling calm in situations that would normally trigger panic. When a Soviet squad charged a German position in the dense forests of Belarus, defenders who had taken Eukodal reacted with a brutal efficiency that stunned even their superiors. Their actions were not reckless, they were detached, methodical, sustained. Some soldiers themselves noticed the shift. Few confided to medics that they felt separate from their bodies during combat, as though they were watching themselves strike, thrust, or fire without fully inhabiting the moment. Others described a coldness that concerned them, not a tactical focus, but an emotional void where fear, hesitation, and moral resistance once lived. Yet many embraced it. In a war fought at close range, numbness could feel like protection. The brutality escalated not because the drug made men violent, but because it removed the brakes, the instinctive flinch, the surge of dread, the hesitation that comes from confronting another human being face to face. This chemical detachment allowed soldiers to push further, stay longer, and strike harder than their unmedicated counterparts. By 1943, the connection between Eukodal and close combat ferocity was quietly understood among frontline officers. No one discussed it openly. To do so would mean acknowledging that part of the army's fearsome reputation was artificially engineered. Instead, they framed these episodes as examples of fighting spirit, of Aryan willpower, of unwavering commitment to victory. But the soldiers knew. When the fighting ended, when the numbness wore off, when the memories flooded back, many sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile what they had done with who they had been before the pill. In the end, the surge in close combat brutality was not born of ideology or training. It was born of chemistry, a drug that deadened pain, dulled terror, and turned the most terrifying moments of war into something a man could walk through without fully feeling. The Eastern Front was unlike anything the German army had faced before, a battlefield so vast, brutal, and unrelenting that it reshaped every soldier who stepped onto it. The cold alone was a force of nature, turning rifles into frozen iron rods and men into shivering silhouettes drifting through endless fields of snow. Hunger gnawed constantly, mud swallowed boots whole. Frostbite crept into fingers, toes, and faces. And the Red Army, fighting on home soil, met the invaders with an intensity that shocked even veteran units. Under these conditions, Eukodal didn't simply circulate. It became a lifeline. At first, it was pain that drove the dependency. Winter wounds healed slowly. Infections spread under layers of wet wool. A man who fell and struck his knee might limp for weeks, forced to march through conditions that would cripple even the strongest back home. Medics, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of casualties, reached more frequently for the small white tablets that brought immediate relief. A soldier who cried out from frozen joints could become functional again within minutes. A man delirious from fever could be steadied into a calm, manageable state. The pressure on medical staff left little room for restraint, but pain was only the surface. In the East, fear lived in every shadow, the fear of encirclement, of ambushes in the pine forests, of Soviet snipers hidden in trees, of night attacks that seemed to materialize from the snow itself. Men slept in bursts of minutes, often with their rifles still in hand. Entire companies marched through blizzards with visibility near zero, guided only by the man in front of them. Under these conditions, Eukodal offered more than pain relief. It offered detachment. A soldier dosed with the drug could look at the same blizzard, the same corpse half buried in ice, the same blood-soaked trench, and feel nothing. It turned the sensory brutality of the Eastern Front into something distant, almost dreamlike. For men drowning under the weight of exhaustion and terror, this numbness felt like salvation. Dependency grew quickly. Units that had resisted the drug in earlier campaigns found themselves seeking it routinely in Russia. A sergeant who once scoffed at the idea of painkillers began requesting tablets before night patrols because they helped him focus. A machine gunner took them to suppress tremors in his hands from the cold. A scout used them to steady his nerves before slipping alone into forests filled with unseen enemies. What had once been a tool became ritual. As the war dragged on, the front demanded more than human endurance. Soldiers fought in temperatures that cracked steel, marched through mud that turned rifles into dead weight, and dug trenches in soil frozen as hard as stone. The strain was inescapable, and each time a man took Eukodal to push past his breaking point, his reliance deepened. By late 1942, dependency had transformed into dependency at scale. Entire platoons operated on chemical endurance, though no official record ever acknowledged it. Medics carried twice the amount of Eukodal they had in previous years. Officers, desperate to keep understrength units functional, quietly encouraged its use. Even corps-level, Staff noticed that divisions fighting on the Eastern Front consumed unusually high quantities of medical analgesics, a bureaucratic phrasing that concealed a much darker truth. Worse still, Soviet offensives routinely cut supply lines, leaving addicted soldiers without access to the drug. Withdrawal in the Eastern Front's chaos was agony sweating in sub-zero temperatures, tremors making it impossible to load rifles, waves of nausea hitting in the middle of combat. Some men grew erratic, others collapsed. A few begged their medics for relief that no longer existed. The dependency forged in the East was not born of weakness, but of conditions designed to crush the human spirit. Men who would have fought bravely under normal circumstances found themselves chemically tethered to survival, unable to function without a drug that had become as essential as food or ammunition. In the vast frozen expanse where Germany's ambitions met an immovable wall, Eucodal became the quiet, invisible chain that kept soldiers moving long after their bodies had given up. The frontline medic was never meant to be a gatekeeper of addiction. He entered the war as a healer, a man trained to stop bleeding, bind wounds, administer morphine when needed, and save as many lives as battlefield chaos allowed. But as the war deepened and pain became the defining language of every campaign, medics found themselves pulled into a role no training manual had prepared them for. They became, slowly and reluctantly, the quiet distributors of a drug that blurred the line between mercy and dependence. At first, the shift felt harmless. A medic treated a man with a gunshot wound and slipped him a tablet when morphine supplies ran low. Another soothed a soldier, shaking uncontrollably after a night of artillery bombardment. A third helped a frost-bitten infantryman march again by dulling the pain that radiated up his legs. In each case, the pill felt like the right choice, a small intervention in a landscape where survival often depended on such decisions. But in an army strained by relentless offensives and insufficient rest, requests for Eucodal multiplied. Soldiers approached medics not only in moments of crisis but in hours of fear, exhaustion, and despair. They queued outside medical tents with excuses that blurred into one another. The pain is back. I can't sleep. My hands won't stop shaking. I need to stay alert tonight. Some were genuine, others were desperate. A few were already addicted, medics overwhelmed by the unending flow of casualties and the pressure to keep units operational, rarely had the time or authority to say no. The army's silence on the issue felt like approval. The officers' expectations left no room for hesitation, and the soldiers' pleading eyes, hollowed by pain, terror, and cold, were impossible to ignore. Each tablet handed over felt like an act of compassion, even as it quietly fed a growing dependence. In some sectors, the medic's satchel became the most sought-after object in the entire company. Men whispered about which medics were more generous, which ones rationed strictly, and which could be persuaded with a personal plea or an offer to trade supplies. A hierarchy emerged, unspoken but understood. Medics with access to Eucodal held a kind of power that neither rank nor insignia could confer. The pressure on medics grew heavier in the East, where conditions collapsed into something beyond human endurance. When an understrength platoon needed to hold a defensive line through the night, officers hinted subtly or directly that a boost might help. When a retreat threatened to turn into panic, medics were told to steady the men. That phrase, in practice, meant distributing pills. The drug became a management tool, a way to suppress panic, maintain cohesion, and keep exhausted bodies from falling apart. Eventually, some medics began keeping informal records, small notebooks tucked into their coats, tracking which soldiers had taken doses and how recently. Others abandoned record-keeping altogether, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of requests. They rationed based on instinct, intuition, or crisis, not medical guidelines. But the darkest transformation came when medics realized they were also beholden to the drug. Not all succumbed, but many lived under conditions no less brutal than the soldiers they treated. They witnessed pain on a scale civilians could never imagine, men missing, limbs, faces torn by shrapnel, bodies broken in ways that haunted dreams. To survive such sights, some medics took Eucodal themselves, rationalizing each tablet as a way to stay focused, calm, and steady. The drug that had once been a tool for treatment became, for a few, a refuge. In the end, medics never intended to become dealers. They were forced into it by a war that demanded more from them than any man could give. They had no legal authority to regulate dosages, no psychological training to manage dependency, no support system to ease the burden. They had only a satchel of tablets and a battlefield filled with men who depended on them. What began as mercy became complicity, and the medics, trapped between duty and desperation, became unintentional brokers in a crisis the army refused to acknowledge, even as it consumed the very men it relied upon to keep fighting. Withdrawal did not arrive like a sudden collapse. It crept in slowly, silently, like frost spreading across the inside of a tent flap. A soldier would begin to sweat in the cold, shaking even as the temperature plunged below freezing. His hands trembled when he tried to load his rifle. His breath grew shallow, quick, uneven. At first, these symptoms could be mistaken for exhaustion or fear, but soon the signs became unmistakable. The aching bones, the relentless nausea, the hollow stare of a man whose body had grown dependent on something it could no longer have. In the cramped, filthy foxholes of the Eastern Front, withdrawal became another enemy, invisible, unrelenting, and merciless. At night, soldiers curled into themselves, shivering beneath lice-infested blankets. The wind howled through the trees, and men shook violently, not from cold alone but from the absence of the pill their bodies had come to expect. Their minds ran in circles, thoughts fractured by the pounding in their chests. Some whispered prayers, others begged for sleep that would not come. A man in withdrawal couldn't hide his suffering. Even in darkness, his laboured breathing could be heard along the trench line. Comrades tried to help. They offered water from canteens, wrapped extra coats around the trembling shoulders, or placed hands on the heaving backs of men retching into mud. But there was little they could do. Withdrawal was not a wound they could bandage, or a fever they could break. It was a silent unravelling, the human body turning against itself. For medics, these moments were among the hardest. They recognised the symptoms instantly: the shaking, the dilated pupils, the sweating even in freezing conditions. They saw soldiers who had marched for weeks suddenly, unable to stand without collapsing. They watched as once strong men lost coordination, their hands slipping when they tried to clean their rifles or load ammunition. More than once, withdrawal struck during combat, turning a capable soldier into a liability at the worst possible moment. But there were no protocols, no official instructions for dealing with addiction. The army did not acknowledge the crisis, therefore the crisis did not exist. Medics could only treat the symptoms, offer fluids when available, encourage rest, or administer the last remaining tablets when the risk to the unit outweighed the risk of enabling dependency. These decisions were excruciating. A single pill could steady a man enough to survive the next attack, but it also tightened the grip of addiction. Some officers responded with anger or disbelief. They mistook withdrawal tremors for cowardice or insubordination. A soldier who couldn't hold his rifle steady might be reprimanded. A man who vomited from nausea during a march was sometimes accused of malingering. The stigma forced many soldiers to hide their condition, tightening their jaws and masking their agony as best they could, until their bodies betrayed them. In the worst cases, withdrawal drove men into panic. One private, during a Soviet artillery barrage, clawed at his own uniform, convinced insects were crawling beneath his skin. Another collapsed in the snow, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to process the overwhelming sensory assault without the chemical barrier he had relied on. These scenes were rarely reported. They remained trapped in the memories of survivors who watched their comrades break apart in ways the war's official records could never capture. Yet even in withdrawal, duty did not pause. Orders still came. Attacks still began at dawn. Soldiers in the throes of chemical agony were expected to hold the line, fire their rifles, and march with their units. Some managed through sheer willpower. Others relied on comrades to steady them, guide them, or carry their equipment. A few quietly traded everything they had, cigarettes, rations, even personal letters from home, for a fragment of a pill. Withdrawal turned foxholes into crucibles. It exposed the human cost of a hidden crisis the Reich refused to acknowledge. Men were expected to endure not only the cold, the hunger, and the terror of the front, but also the violent rebellion of their own bodies. It was a battle within a battle, private, unseen, and devastating. And as supplies thinned and dependency deepened, the silent suffering in the foxholes grew into one of the most destructive forces, undermining the very army that had once marched across Europe with unstoppable momentum. The myth began quietly, a whispered remark in a command tent, a line in a field report, an expression of disbelief from officers who watched their men endure conditions no training manual could have prepared them for. Certain battalions seemed to push farther, march longer, and fight harder than anyone thought humanly possible. They held lines against overwhelming odds, advanced through terrain that swallowed lesser units, and absorbed casualties that should have shattered them. They became known informally as the unbreakable battalions. But their resilience was not born of discipline alone, nor was it the result of superior tactics, special training, or ideological fervor. Behind the legend lay something far more fragile, a chemical endurance built on Eucodal, a drug that kept bodies moving and minds steady long after both should have collapsed. These battalions often emerged in sectors where the fighting was worst. The forests around Smolensk, the frozen outskirts of Leningrad, the ravaged farmlands of Ukraine. Units stationed there were pushed to extremes not seen on other fronts. Reinforcements arrived, late or not at all. Supplies dwindled, soldiers marched, for days through snowstorms so thick they could barely see the man in front of them. And through it all, medics dispensed Eucodal not as treatment, but as fuel. At first, commanders attributed their endurance to leadership. A charismatic captain, a seasoned sergeant, a particularly cohesive unit. These explanations appeared in battlefield summaries sent to Berlin. But privately, officers noticed something else. The men did not simply fight hard, they fought with a kind of detached calm that bordered on unnatural. They shrugged off injuries that would have incapacitated others. They marched through exhaustion without complaint. They reacted to sudden ambushes with eerie composure, as if fear had been carved out of them. One officer, writing in a letter never meant for official eyes, described his battalion as steady to the point of strangeness, as if they are present, but not fully here. Another recorded how his men walked through a Soviet mortar barrage with a quiet resolve that unnerved even their own comrades. Medics, when pressed, offered vague explanations. They are handling the strain better than expected, they would say. But the truth sat at the bottom of their satchels, white tablets handed out before night marches, before defensive stands, before assaults that both sides knew would be bloody. Success reinforced the cycle. Each time an unbreakable battalion accomplished the impossible, higher command demanded more. Companies that had fought for 36 hours without rest were ordered to advance again. Units that had marched 50 kilometers through swamps were assigned to dig new defensive lines. Officers, desperate to maintain this superhuman pace, turned increasingly to the medics, worn down by the endless suffering around them, complied. Not all soldiers embraced the drug. Some resisted, preferring pain to numbness. Others feared the withdrawal they had seen in bunkmates shaking uncontrollably at dawn. But once a unit's rhythm became chemically reinforced, resistance carried a price. A man who refused a dose risked falling behind, slowing the march, or failing in an assault. Peer pressure and survival instinct did the rest. Inevitably, cracks formed. After weeks on the line, soldiers who once marched without complaint began to collapse without warning. Their bodies, pushed past natural limits, deteriorated rapidly. Muscles tore, joints inflamed. Old injuries resurfaced with brutal intensity. Some drifted into hallucinations during combat, confusing friend and foe. Others grew emotionally vacant, unable to laugh, speak, or react to anything beyond the immediate task in front of them. Commanders, confronted with these breakdowns, finally understood the truth. Unbreakable battalions were not stronger than the rest. They were simply burning through their strength faster. The myth of their endurance persisted, but the reality beneath it was far darker. An army, holding itself together with chemicals, squeezing every ounce of strength from its soldiers until there was nothing left to give. These battalions were not unbreakable. They were breaking slowly, quietly, and inevitably held together only by the fragile thread of a drug the Reich refused to acknowledge, even as it consumed the very men it depended on. Discipline had always been the spine of the German army. Orders flowed downward with precision, and obedience flowed upward with equal intensity. For officers, maintaining control was not just a responsibility, it was the very mechanism by which the war machine functioned. But by the midpoint of the war, something subtle began to fracture within that chain of command. It wasn't mutiny, nor ideological doubt, nor deliberate defiance. It was something quieter, more insidious, a chemically altered fighting force that no longer reacted to orders or to danger in predictable ways. The first signs appeared during night operations. Officers noticed that certain soldiers seemed too calm during chaotic engagements. A squad under heavy machine gun fire might freeze, not in fear, but in an eerie stillness, as if their bodies hadn't registered the danger. Others advanced with reckless indifference, stepping into open fields or walking upright through bombardments. Their behavior was not courage, it was detachment. At first, officers blamed exhaustion or battlefield trauma, but the pattern grew. Men who had taken Ukhodal hours earlier acted with a kind of mechanical obedience, responding to commands without fully processing them. They followed orders to the letter, even when those orders no longer made sense in the shifting chaos of battle. In situations requiring initiative or quick judgment, they faltered. Their minds moved half a beat slower, their instincts dampened by the drug's numbing fog. A lieutenant in the Ukraine sector recorded an encounter in his journal. He ordered a small team to reposition during a Soviet flanking maneuver. 2 soldiers complied instantly, crossing into an exposed trench that had been overrun minutes earlier. They were shot before they could react. The lieutenant later wrote, "They did not hesitate, even though hesitation would have saved them. They moved like men unaware of the danger." This loss of intuitive survival instinct unnerved officers. A soldier dosed with opioids didn't panic, but he also didn't adapt. He became reliable in controlled situations and dangerously unpredictable in fluid ones. The Wehrmacht's doctrine depended on Auftragstaktik, the idea that soldiers should use initiative to execute superior intent even when circumstances changed. But initiative evaporated under Ukhodal's haze. Men followed commands blindly, even if those commands no longer fit the unfolding reality. Worse still, officers found it increasingly difficult to distinguish genuine obedience from chemically induced compliance. A soldier nodding silently during a briefing might not be absorbing the plan. He might simply be drifting through the drug's soft fog. A man showing no fear before a major assault might not be courageous. He might be numb beyond reason. Leaders began to realize they were commanding troops whose mental states varied wildly depending on the pills circulating in the barracks, and the strain on officers themselves grew. Some carried guilt, knowing they had allowed or even encouraged the drug's use to maintain combat readiness. Others grew frustrated, shouting at men whose flat expressions and sluggish reactions revealed that they were physically present but mentally distant. A few tried to crack down, ordering medics to ration doses. But these efforts rarely lasted. When a unit collapsed from exhaustion or panic without chemical reinforcement, officers quietly returned to the old methods. The crisis deepened when officers noticed another grim development. Men suffering withdrawal were nearly impossible to command. Trembling hands dropped rifles. Orders were misunderstood or forgotten. During retreats, some soldiers lagged so severely that entire units became vulnerable. Officers who once prided themselves on maintaining iron discipline now found themselves managing symptoms of dependence, rationing pills not based on injury, but based on operational necessity. One captain described his situation bluntly: "I no longer command men. I command their symptoms." By late 1943, the WWII, Wehrmacht's leadership structure, built on clarity, order, and responsiveness, was slowly eroding under the weight of chemical influence. Officers were losing not the loyalty of their men, but their reliability, their judgment, their resilience. The drug that once kept battalions functioning was now undermining the very principles that made the German army formidable. The High Command never acknowledged this collapse. Reports spoke only of discipline, valor, or fatigue, never dependency. But in the field, officers confronted a truth no doctrine could fix. An army that could no longer feel pain was also an army that could no longer feel fear, caution, or instinct. Control was slipping, not through rebellion, but through chemistry, and no amount of discipline could command a soldier whose mind had been numbed into silence. The German army had always believed in pushing beyond limits, marching farther, striking harder, enduring longer than any enemy. But by the middle years of the war, much of that endurance was no longer coming from training, discipline, or morale. It came from chemistry. Eukodal allowed soldiers to keep moving long after their bodies had begun to fail, masking wounds, exhaustion, and trauma beneath a veneer of artificial strength. To the casual observer, this looked like resilience. To commanders, it looked like tactical advantage. But beneath the surface, the cost was rising quietly, steadily, and irreversibly. At first, the consequences were subtle. A soldier who took Eukodal during a forced march might finish the march without complaint, only to collapse the moment he stopped moving. He felt no pain while the drug was active, but once it faded, the damage revealed itself in brutal clarity, torn muscles, raw joints, bleeding blisters he hadn't noticed forming. These were not minor injuries. They accumulated, compounding day after day, until the soldier reached a point of physical breakdown with no warning. Yet the army counted him as fit until the moment he fell. In the frozen forests east of Smolensk, a platoon marched through snowdrifts for nearly 30 hours straight, driven by a desperate need to reach a defensive position before Soviet forces broke through. Medics distributed Eukodal at regular intervals, watching as the men straightened their backs and resumed walking despite frost-bitten feet and burning lungs. When they finally reached their objective, 8 soldiers collapsed immediately. 2 never regained consciousness. No one blamed the drug, the war itself was blamed, the cold, the fatigue. But those who had watched the men stumble onward under chemical fog understood what had really happened. Strength borrowed is strength that must someday be repaid. The same pattern appeared during prolonged assaults. Soldiers fought through fractures, burns, and shrapnel wounds, unaware of the extent of their injuries until the drug loosened its grip. A man who had no feeling in his leg during an attack would discover afterward that he could no longer stand. A grenadier who survived melee combat without flinching learned minutes later that a deep stab wound had nearly severed muscle. Pain was delayed, but damage was not. This false strength had strategic consequences too. Commanders misjudged their unit's capabilities, believing they could endure more than they truly could. Reports boasted of remarkable stamina and resilience, not realizing these were chemically induced illusions. When the drug wore off at critical moments during night defenses, forced retreats, or sudden Soviet counterattacks, entire formations faltered. One infantry company defending a key bridge near the Don River held their ground with chilling calm for nearly 4 hours under relentless assault. When their supply of Eukodal ran out just before dawn, their composure evaporated within minutes. Tremors spread through the line, rifles slipped from shaking hands. Panic, long suppressed, surged back with a vengeance. The company broke, and the bridge fell. Official reports blamed exhaustion. But the survivors knew the truth. The price for that earlier numbness had come due all at once. Emotionally, the toll was no less severe. The drug dulled fear, but it also dulled judgment. It muted grief, but it also muted humanity. Men who felt nothing during combat often felt too much afterward. When the chemical shield lifted, suppressed terror and guilt came crashing down. Soldiers experienced violent mood swings, bouts of uncontrollable crying, or numb emotional voids that left them hollow and unreachable. Some officers privately wrote that these episodes were more terrifying than battle. And then there was the ultimate cost, dependency that outlasted strength. Soldiers who relied on Ukudal to march, fight, or even sleep could not function without it. When supply lines failed, as they did repeatedly in the East, withdrawal devastated entire units. A battalion that had seemed unstoppable one week could be barely operational the next, crippled not by enemy fire, but by the collapse of its own chemically propped-up momentum. The cost of false strength was not always immediate, but it was always inevitable. Every tablet borrowed time the body could not repay. And as the war stretched on, as defeats mounted and desperation grew, the army leaned harder on this brittle foundation, unaware or unwilling to admit that it was building victory on legs already buckling beneath the weight of chemical illusion. In the end, Ukudal did not make the soldiers stronger. It made them seem stronger until the moment reality returned. Swift and unforgiving, demanding payment for every borrowed step, tolerance did not arrive with fanfare. There was no dramatic moment when a soldier realized the pill no longer worked as it once had. Instead, the shift unfolded gradually, like a silent tightening no one could pinpoint. A man who once felt profound relief from a single tablet began noticing that its effects faded sooner. The numbness didn't last through a full march. The steady calm evaporated halfway through a night watch. The warm cushion between himself and the pain grew thinner, weaker, unreliable. In the brutal logic of war, the answer to this problem seemed obvious. Take more. By the middle years of the conflict, medics across multiple sectors reported that soldiers were returning for second doses far more frequently than before. They approached with the same excuses: pain in the leg, tremors, nerves, sleeplessness, but with a new urgency behind their words. A corporal who once stretched his supply across several days now asked for another pill only hours after the first. A machine gunner insisted he needed a double dose to quell the shaking from prolonged combat. Even the stoic veterans, men hardened by countless battles, began seeking more frequent relief. The medics knew what was happening. In medical school, tolerance was a familiar concept, the body adapting, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect. But out here, on the front lines, acknowledging tolerance meant acknowledging addiction, and addiction was something the army refused to accept as possible. So the problem went unspoken, buried beneath the immediate demands of survival. Some medics tried to ration more strictly. They reduced dosages, encouraged rest, or substituted weaker painkillers. These efforts rarely succeeded. Soldiers, desperate for relief, sought other sources, trading cigarettes, food rations, boots, even personal valuables for spare tablets. They searched abandoned medical kits on dead comrades, scavenged field stations, and begged anyone with access for just one more. The culture of quiet dependency, already deeply rooted, became a culture of escalating demand. Commanders noticed changes too. Men who had once fought with machine-like endurance now faltered when unable to secure an extra dose. Units that had maintained remarkable stamina began slowing, stumbling, or becoming erratic. What officers initially dismissed as exhaustion gradually revealed a deeper pattern. Their soldiers were no longer simply fatigued. They were chemically tethered to their performance. This rising tolerance reshaped the rhythm of battle. A soldier who marched with controlled calm while medicated became jittery and unfocused when the drug began to wear off. During extended engagements, men became dangerously inconsistent calm in one moment, trembling uncontrollably in the next. In close combat, delayed reactions proved fatal. In retreats, wavering judgment led to disorganized movements. The battlefield, already chaotic, became more unpredictable. as dependency warped the soldiers' internal equilibrium. The psychological effects were just as profound. A soldier who once used Eucadal sparingly now found himself unable to sleep without it. Anxiety surged when a dose wore off. Fear, long masked, returned with amplified force. Hallucinations became more frequent during withdrawal cycles. One infantryman on the Leningrad front reported seeing figures in the snow that vanished when approached. Another spent hours convinced he heard voices whispering from the tree line. Meanwhile, the supply chain struggled to keep pace. As tolerance rose across entire divisions, the demand for Eucadal increased exponentially. Medical requisitions soared, and officers in supply commands issued repeated warnings that consumption was outpacing production. But the battlefield did not allow time for nuance. When a unit's performance declined, the simplistic solution was always the same: issue more. By late 1942, the drug had become both crutch and curse, a chemical that enabled soldiers to continue functioning while simultaneously deepening their dependency to crippling levels. The army had crossed an invisible threshold, no longer using Eucadal as a remedy, but relying on it as infrastructure. Tolerance was not a medical complication. It was a slow-burning catastrophe, one that amplified every weakness, every strain, every psychological fracture. The men who once stood as the backbone of the German war machine were now bound to a substance that the regime refused to acknowledge, a substance that demanded more with every passing month. And as the war's tide turned against Germany, that demand would grow to levels no supply line could sustain, and no soldier could endure without breaking. The hidden machinery powering Germany's opioid crisis did not lie in bunkers or barracks, but in laboratories far from the front, behind polished doors and under the stark glow of fluorescent lights. Teams of chemists in pressed white coats worked with quiet intensity, crafting the compounds that would shape the fate of soldiers thousands of kilometers away. They operated in a world of precision glass instruments, simmering beakers, and meticulously catalogued research notes. A world insulated from mud, frostbite, and artillery, yet deeply entwined with the suffering they inadvertently enabled. Germany's chemical and pharmaceutical industries were among the most advanced in the world. Companies like Bayer, Merck, and Boehringer had built reputations on innovation, producing dyes, fertilizers, and medicines that transformed modern life. When the war began, these firms were swiftly integrated into the national war effort. They received contracts from the military, directives from the government, and pressure from party officials. Their scientists were instructed, often subtly, sometimes explicitly, to develop compounds that enhanced endurance, suppressed pain, or stabilized psychological strain. Within this environment, drugs like Eucadal emerged not as sinister creations, but as scientific triumphs. Chemists viewed them as tools to push the boundaries of medicine, to solve problems that wartime demanded. They refined formulas with clinical detachment, celebrating increased potency or faster onset times, without fully understanding how these attributes translated on the battlefield. Their conversations centered on molecular structures, efficiency curves, and dosage trials, never on the trembling hands of a soldier deep in withdrawal or the hollow gaze of a man numbed beyond emotion. Many of these scientists believed they were serving the fatherland with intellect rather than weaponry. They worked overtime, driven by patriotic duty and professional ambition. Their laboratories hummed with activity day and night. Some even expressed pride when reports indicated that frontline soldiers were performing exceptionally after receiving their products, unaware or choosing not to think about the toll these chemicals exacted. The disconnection was stark. While soldiers suffered in trenches, these chemists debated purity, ratios and production yields over cups of coffee in heated rooms. Yet not all were oblivious. A few researchers noticed troubling signs in early clinical data. Volunteers in test trials exhibited mood disturbances, tolerance build-up, or signs of dependency. Notes were written, concerns were raised, but the wartime climate valued results over caution. Supervisors dismissed warnings as exaggerated, arguing that such issues were irrelevant compared to the battlefield's immediate demands. A drug that diminished pain and boosted endurance was invaluable. Potential long-term consequences were post-war problems. Still, some chemists felt unease. They read field reports describing soldiers who returned to active duty suspiciously fast after severe injuries. They saw requisition requests for Eucodal climbing at alarming rates. In hushed tones, they speculated that the military might be using the drug beyond intended guidelines. But speculation led nowhere. No one wanted to challenge a system built on silence. The Reich's propaganda machine reinforced this compliant atmosphere. Scientists were praised as heroes of innovation, their work framed as essential to national survival. Posters depicted researchers as stalwart guardians of the homeland, transforming science into salvation. Within this echo chamber, questioning the ethical implications of their work felt almost like treason. Yet the truth remained. The chemists provided the raw material for a crisis they never witnessed firsthand. They manufactured the illusion of invincibility that frontline soldiers were forced to uphold. Their breakthroughs became instruments of suffering when placed in the hands of medics pressured to keep men fighting at any cost. And so, behind the sterile walls of their laboratories, the chemists of the fatherland continued their work, unaware that the compounds they perfected would drive soldiers into dependency, distort officers' expectations, and fuel a war machine that devoured the very men sworn to carry it forward. They produced strength on paper, not realizing it would become fragility in practice. Their role in the crisis was neither intentional nor innocent. It was essential. In every war, commanders count what they can see: tanks, ammunition, rations, casualties. But addiction leaves no crater in the earth. It leaves no burned-out vehicles on the roadside. It does not appear in tactical diagrams or supply ledgers. And so, even as thousands of soldiers quietly slid into dependency, the crisis remained invisible to the systems built to track the health of an army. The Wehrmacht measured everything except the one thing eating away at its ranks from within. Part of the problem was structural. The German military medical system was designed to monitor physical injuries, infectious diseases, and combat effectiveness. Doctors filled out detailed forms for bullet wounds, fractures, trench foot, frostbite, and dysentery. But no category existed for chemical dependency. No space on the report. No code for the ledger. If a soldier shook uncontrollably, vomited during marches, or collapsed from withdrawal, the diagnosis was typically recorded under vague terms: exhaustion, nervous strain, combat stress, or unfit for duty. These categories absorbed the symptoms of addiction without addressing their cause. Even if an officer suspected chemical dependence, acknowledging it meant admitting something the army refused to believe: that its soldiers, the ideological and physical embodiment of the Reich's strength, could be weakened by a pill meant to help them. Pride, denial, and propaganda combined to obscure the truth. Medics, overwhelmed by wounded men and relentless fighting, didn't have the time or authority to document patterns. They treated symptoms as they appeared. A soldier asking for a dose too often, he was in pain. A man trembling before an assault, he was afraid. A soldier collapsing in a trench, he was exhausted. These explanations fit comfortably into the narrative of war. Addiction did not. Meanwhile, the unseen numbers grew. In one regiment near Kharkov, nearly a third of the soldiers regularly requested Eucodal, yet no report ever mentioned it. In a panzer division, retreating from the Caucasus, medics administered hundreds of doses during a single week-long withdrawal. But the official record documented only heightened medical activity. In infantry battalions locked in close-quarters combat around Stalingrad, usage levels climbed so sharply that some medical kits ran empty within days. Yet the only figures that reached Germany referenced casualty counts and ammunition expenditure. Even the medical depots feeding the front had no idea what they were enabling. They shipped crates labelled analgesics, without tracking how quickly or slowly they were consumed. In some sectors, WWII orders increased by 300% in 6 months, but because all painkillers were categorized together, the spike blended into the general fog of wartime supply chaos. The silence extended upward. Generals received glowing reports of endurance, resilience, and minimal complaints of pain, results they interpreted as proof of their soldiers' superiority. The possibility that this performance was chemically sustained never circled the staff tables. Addicted soldiers were invisible not because their suffering was subtle, but because the system refused to look. The cost of this blindness grew heavy. Addicted soldiers performed unpredictably. They were steady one day and trembling the next. They pushed themselves far beyond physical limits, then collapsed with shocking suddenness. Units that seemed unstoppable crumbled overnight when supply lines broke, revealing the fragile foundation beneath their apparent strength. Commanders miscalculated, sending chemically overextended men into operations requiring clear judgment and stable endurance. When those missions failed, the blame fell on weather, enemy resistance, or poor luck, never on dependency. The crisis remained undocumented, unacknowledged, and unmeasured, not because it was small, but because it was everywhere. It hid behind numbers that looked normal, behind assumptions that seemed rational, behind soldiers who tried desperately to appear strong even as their bodies revolted. In a war obsessed with metrics, how many shells fired, how many kilometers gained, how many enemy positions taken, addiction was the one threat that left no visible trace. It slipped through every crack in the system, proliferating unseen, unspoken, and uncontested. No one measured it, no one tracked it, no one planned for it. And by the time the army realized the scale of what it faced, the crisis had already hollowed out entire divisions, leaving behind the silent ruin of men who had fought longer, harder, and more desperately than their bodies should ever have allowed. In the hierarchy of the Third Reich, few figures loomed as large as Hermann Goering, flamboyant, ambitious, and saturated with self-made myth. He dressed in ornate uniforms, collected art with ruthless efficiency, and spoke with bombastic confidence about Germany's destiny. But beneath the theatrical exterior, beneath the medals and custom-tailored silk, lay a truth that the regime worked tirelessly to conceal. One of Hitler's most powerful men was himself addicted to opioids. Goering's addiction did not begin with the war. It began decades earlier, in the closing years of the First World War, when he was treated for severe injuries sustained as a fighter pilot. Morphine entered his bloodstream as pain relief. It never left. By the late 1920s, his dependency was so pronounced that even his political allies whispered about his erratic behavior. During the early rise of the Nazi Party, Goering oscillated between manic energy and hollow detachment symptoms. His associates chalked up to stress or exhaustion, but which insiders recognized as withdrawal and relapse. Hitler tolerated it. The party needed Goering's charisma, his connections, his ability to manipulate bureaucracy. And Goering needed Hitler's protection, because without it, his dependency might have ended his political career before it began. Even after the Nazis seized power, Goering's addiction remained an open secret behind closed doors. Doctors prescribed him vast quantities of painkillers under the guise of medical necessity. Private physicians were assigned to manage his condition, though. Manage often meant feeding the habit rather than curbing it. By the time the Second World War began, Goering was not merely an addict. He was a man whose daily functioning depended on chemical stability. Yet he stood at the apex of power, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, heir apparent to Hitler. His decisions shaped entire fronts. His policies determined supply flows, resource allocations, and military readiness. And all the while, the drugs coursing through his veins shaped him. WWII, ironically, was among the opioids he relied upon. In documents uncovered after the war, medical logs confirmed a steady pattern of prescriptions. His personal physician maintained a regimen designed to keep him alert during crucial meetings and sedated during periods of agitation. When Goering's mood darkened, as it often did, higher doses were administered. When he appeared too sluggish to command, stimulants were layered atop opioids to rouse him. His physiology became a battlefield of chemicals, each dose attempting to correct the last. Those around him noticed the instability. In high-level conferences, Goering sometimes drifted into rambling monologues, his thoughts circling in on themselves. At other times, he displayed a chilling calm, detached from the urgency of collapsing fronts. His promises to Hitler grew more unrealistic, more grandiose, as though he believed his own chemically buoyed confidence could rewrite the laws of war. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, the branch he proudly claimed as his own creation, deteriorated. Planes were grounded by fuel shortages he failed to address. Pilot training collapsed under his mismanagement. Critical decisions about aircraft production were postponed or made impulsively, sometimes after Goering arrived to meetings in a haze. Subordinates learned to read his condition before making requests. Approach him on stimulant days. Avoid him on withdrawal days. Yet no one dared confront him. The Nazi regime could not admit that one of its most decorated leaders carried the same weakness it condemned in others. So Goering's addiction remained buried beneath ceremony, uniforms, and propaganda. Even as he chastised soldiers for lack of discipline, he retreated each night to the care of physicians who stabilized him with precisely the substances rotting the army from within. The hypocrisy was staggering, but typical of the regime. A system that preached strength while its own leaders crumbled behind closed doors. Goering's addiction did more than warp his judgment. It reflected the deeper crisis gripping the Reich. At the top of the empire stood a man who relied on drugs to function, giving orders to an army increasingly dependent on the same chemicals. The rot began at the summit, disguised by medals and rhetoric, and spread downward into the ranks. In a war built on illusions, Goering embodied the greatest illusion of all, a leader who appeared powerful, decisive, and immovable even as he struggled to hold himself together, tablet by tablet, dose by dose. Warfare does not erase ethics in a single stroke. It erodes them slowly, quietly, until what once seemed unthinkable becomes routine. In the Wehrmacht's medical corps, this erosion took place not through malice, but through exhaustion, pressure, and the relentless demands of a war that punished hesitation and rewarded results. The doctors who marched into Poland believing they would save lives soon found themselves balancing their oath against the grim arithmetic of survival. And in that space between duty and necessity, ethics began to fade. Before the war, German physicians were trained with strict professional standards. They were taught to avoid overprescribing opioids, to monitor patients for dependency, to treat addiction as a medical condition requiring intervention. But the front lines of a mechanized, total war bore little resemblance to civilian practice. In field tents filled with groaning men, flu-stricken soldiers, and amputees trembling on wooden tables, the calculations changed. Pain relief was no longer a matter of comfort. It was a matter of keeping soldiers functional enough to prevent collapse of entire units. Doctors began to ask themselves difficult questions. If a tablet helped a man stand and fight, wasn't that the greater good? If dulling terror helped a battalion survive an assault, did the long-term risks matter? If orders demanded movement, and pain made that impossible, what choice was there? These questions chipped away at principles that had once been considered sacred, and the more often they were answered with, yes, for now, the easier it became to ignore the consequences. The first compromise was small, giving a soldier an extra dose because the pain was worse than expected. The 24 Rives next came when officers requested support for men who needed to stay alert through the night. After that, the boundaries dissolved quickly. Doctors stopped tracking how often a patient returned for pills. They began handing out Eucadal based on intuition rather than need. They told themselves it was temporary, an emergency measure, until reinforcements arrived, until winter ended, until the next supply run came through. But the emergencies never ended. As the war dragged on, ethical shortcuts became standard procedure. Some doctors began pre-dosing soldiers before offensives, believing it would reduce fear and panic. Others rationed drugs, not for medical reasons, but for tactical ones. Give more to assault units, less to supply teams, more to veterans, less to replacements. The logic was cold, but the battlefield demanded cold logic. A doctor who refused to bend became an obstacle to the war effort, and obstacles were not tolerated. There were moments of hesitation, instances where physicians realized they were drifting dangerously far from their oath. One medical officer near Orel wrote in his diary, "I no longer heal men, I prepare them to be used." Another, stationed near Novgorod, confessed privately that he feared he was breaking soldiers more than he was helping them. These murmurs never reached command. They were buried beneath fear, shame, and the understanding that speaking openly would be career-ending or worse. Meanwhile, higher-ranking medical administrators distanced themselves from the front's grim realities. In Berlin, discussions about opioid risks remained abstract. Bureaucrats debated dosage guidelines and production quotas with the detachment of men reviewing factory output. Ethics, in these meetings, became footnotes rather than guiding principles. The priority was clear: maintain fighting strength at all costs. If doctors in the field had to stretch the boundaries of medical practice to achieve that, then those boundaries were considered expendable. By 1943, the ethical framework of the Wehrmacht's medical system had all but collapsed. Doctors were no longer guardians of health. They were facilitators of endurance. Their role had shifted from protecting the soldier's body to prolonging its usefulness. In a war shaped by propaganda and desperation, this shift felt not only necessary but inevitable, yet the consequences were devastating. Soldiers who trusted their doctors were quietly led into dependency. Men who believed they were receiving care were instead receiving orders in chemical form, and physicians who once swore to do no harm became, through silence and compromise, participants in a system that consumed its own. The ethics had not vanished in a single moment. They had been worn down pill by pill, order by order, until nothing remained but the cold practicality of a war that demanded everything and forgave nothing. Deep beneath the German-occupied cities and along fortified command posts, small rooms humbly labelled as pharmacies held the lifeblood of the front in chemical form. These were not bustling civilian pharmacies, adorned with polished counters and neat rows of bottles. They were windowless, chambers tucked within bunkers, dimly lit by flickering bulbs, lined with shelves stacked high with vials, tablets, and carefully labelled crates. Here, Eucadal was stored alongside morphine, sedatives, and other analgesics, a quiet arsenal that, for soldiers and officers alike, became as essential as rifles or ammunition. Bunker pharmacies were staffed by military pharmacists, enlisted personnel trained to manage supplies for entire divisions. Their duties were logistical, but carried a moral weight few outside the medical corps understood. They had to ensure that enough doses reached field medics while accounting for the unpredictable consumption rates of soldiers enduring frost, hunger, and combat. A single miscalculation could mean a battalion arriving on the front line without sufficient pain relief, potentially turning a manageable engagement into a catastrophe. The atmosphere in these bunkers was oppressive. The air smelled of antiseptic and cardboard, with faint chemical tangs lingering from repeated handling. Soldiers occasionally slipped in to collect their rations, though most interactions were mediated through medics. A lieutenant might request additional doses for his men before an assault, emphasizing operational necessity, while a medic anxiously calculated how to stretch supplies over days of continuous combat. Every tablet dispensed carried weight, a temporary solution masking an increasingly chronic problem. Supply chains fed these pharmacies methodically. Crates arrived by rail, truck convoys, or even river barges, often mislabeled to avoid bureaucratic scrutiny. Officially, shipments were classified simply as analgesics or field medicines, but inside the crates, rows of Eucodal awaited distribution. The The system worked smoothly on paper. Requisition forms were filled, quantities noted, and deliveries recorded. In practice, few tracked consumption rates or recognized the warning signs of dependency. Officers were concerned only with whether the troops could march, fight, and hold positions, not with what substances enabled them to do so. Pharmacists quickly learned to read the patterns. Requests for doses before night watches, long marches, or major offensives became predictable. They knew which medics would over-dispense and which units had higher consumption rates due to environmental hardship or combat intensity. Yet despite recognizing these patterns, interventions were rare. A shortage of tablets threatened immediate operational capability, so adherence to strict dosage guidelines often gave way to expedients. The immediate imperative of survival outweighed long-term concerns. Bunker pharmacies also became the unseen hubs of chemical dependence. Soldiers who had developed tolerance often received increased doses to maintain functional levels. Withdrawal, though recognized, was managed only insofar as it threatened the soldier's ability to march or fight. No one officially monitored addiction. No officer recorded it in reports. The chemical dependency spreading through the ranks remained invisible in official metrics. Occasionally, officers visited these bunkers personally, inspecting supplies and questioning pharmacists. They were concerned with logistics and efficiency, not medical ethics. Are the men ready? Became the question that mattered. Whether they were physically intact or chemically dependent was irrelevant as long as the division performed. By the mid-war years, bunker pharmacies were less places of healing and more nodes in a system sustaining a war fought on borrowed endurance. Tablets of Eucadal moved like currency, stabilizing soldiers just enough to continue advancing, holding lines, and absorbing casualties that should have rendered them ineffective. The army's performance depended increasingly on these chemical reserves, even as the human cost grew in hidden, unmeasured ways. Within these quiet chambers, the invisible architecture of the addiction crisis took shape, an unspoken testament to a war where human resilience was both weaponized and consumed, one pill at a time. In any military operation, documentation is everything. It ensures that orders are followed, supplies accounted for, casualties recorded, and strategy coordinated across hundreds of miles and countless units. In the case of Eucadal, however, the paper trails that should have tracked its distribution, use, and effects were fragmented, incomplete, or deliberately obscured. What might have been a system of oversight instead became a cloak of invisibility, allowing the drug to flow unchecked and its consequences to remain hidden. The problem began at the front. Medics and battalion pharmacists filled out requisition forms listing the quantities of analgesics requested for upcoming operations. The forms were perfunctory, often filed in triplicate, with little space to distinguish between morphine, sedatives, or synthetic opioids. Many simply recorded pain management, supplies, or standard analgesics, leaving no hint of Eucadal's presence or volume. Orders were approved by officers who did not question the specifics, focusing only on whether the numbers met operational needs. The front lines were chaotic, the flow of paperwork intermittent, and enforcement inconsistent. In this environment, anything could slip through the cracks. Once the crates left central depots, the paper trail became more elusive. Logs documenting shipments were often misfiled, lost during transit, or destroyed to make room for urgent operational documents. Rail, records, truck manifests, and supply lists were coded in ways that made sense to logistics officers, but offered little transparency to higher command. Even when units received Eucadal in large quantities, reports rarely reflected its actual movement. At best, administrators noted medical supplies delivered. At worst, the tablets were simply assumed to have been consumed in the normal course of treatment. Higher up the chain, the bureaucracy reinforced invisibility. Officers compiling reports on supply, readiness, and medical efficiency rarely asked for differentiation among analgesics. Eucadal was included in aggregated statistics, indistinguishable from other painkillers. Its growing use went unnoticed, or worse, was assumed to be a sign of effective medical support. The emphasis on operational performance, speed of advance, casualty return rates, unit cohesion, overshadowed any concern for chemical dependence or overuse. A soldier who walked into a field hospital requesting repeated doses might appear simply diligent about his own care. Intentional concealment also played a role. As reports filtered to Berlin, minor anomalies in consumption were ignored or minimized. Some medics and officers, aware of dependency issues, downplayed usage to avoid scrutiny. Others did not report instances of withdrawal or abuse, knowing that any official acknowledgement could trigger administrative complications or accusations of failure. A soldier, incapacitated by addiction, was often simply categorized as exhausted or unfit for duty, erasing evidence of the underlying chemical problem. The disappearance of paper trails had real consequences. Without accurate records, supply officers could not anticipate demand surges. Units consumed pills faster than production could sustain, leaving men vulnerable during critical operations. Commanders misinterpreted reports of continued performance as proof of human resilience rather than chemical dependence. The illusion of stability became self-reinforcing. The better the drug masked exhaustion and pain, the less anyone questioned its role, and the more the addiction deepened across the ranks. By the time post-war investigators examined surviving documents, many traces of the opioid crisis had vanished entirely. Shipments, doses, and patterns of overuse were scattered across incomplete files, personal notes, and anecdotal reports. The paper trails that might have exposed the full scale of Germany's chemical dependency had disappeared deliberately, accidentally, or inevitably, leaving behind only the silent testimony of soldiers' suffering. In effect, the missing documentation mirrored the hidden nature of the crisis itself. The army marched forward on a foundation of invisible pills, invisible dependence, and invisible oversight, sustained by a bureaucracy that measured everything except the one thing that truly mattered: the human cost of chemical endurance. The battlefield was itself a laboratory, one in which human endurance was pushed past natural limits, often with little concern for the consequences. In this context, Eucodal was no longer simply a medicine. It became a tool for experimentation, a way to measure just how far a soldier could be, stretched before breaking. Field commanders and medics alike noticed patterns in performance that were impossible to explain by training or morale alone, and tacitly, they began to use the drug as a method to gauge and extend the limits of human capability. Early on, these tests were informal. An officer would note that a particular infantry unit had marched 30 kilometers in sub-zero conditions with minimal rest. A medic would remark that the same soldiers remained calm under artillery fire, their trembling suppressed, their focus sharp. The common factor in both observations was Eucodal. The pill quieted the nervous system, dampened fear, and reduced the perception of pain, creating soldiers who appeared superhuman. What had started as chemical relief became a measure of potential performance. As campaigns expanded, the practice became more deliberate. Units were scheduled for night marches or forced marches across muddy terrain, with dosages adjusted to maintain their operational effectiveness. Field reports highlighted men who continued firing rifles, carrying stretchers, or clearing obstacles despite injuries that would have immobilized others. Officers recorded distances covered, duration of activity, and the apparent stamina of troops, often noting in passing that the results were remarkable. Rarely did these documents mention the chemical assistance that had made such feats possible. Medics became reluctant participants in this unofficial testing. They observed soldiers pushing themselves beyond endurance, muscles quivering, joints inflamed, faces pale and sweating, yet they were expected to supply enough Eucodal to maintain the illusion of strength. Failure to comply risked not only operational setbacks, but personal censure. In their notes, they began to include subtle remarks about tolerance and signs of overuse, But these comments were buried beneath layers of bureaucratic language and rarely escalated beyond immediate superiors. The tests themselves took on many forms. Some officers timed forced marches through frozen forests or across river crossings. Others measured sustained combat efficiency during night raids or prolonged firefights. Soldiers were monitored for tremors, signs of fatigue or withdrawal, but the primary goal was functional output. If a man could march, dig trenches, load ammunition, and engage in combat without slowing, he was deemed effective. The cost to his body and mind was secondary and often invisible. Psychological effects were as revealing as physical ones. Soldiers who received Eucadal in these conditions reported an altered perception of time, a dulling of fear, and a reduction in pain signals. Their cognitive functions shifted, prioritizing immediate tasks over self-preservation. Field notes would describe the results clinically. Unit maintained operational tempo beyond expected capacity, without acknowledging that the expected capacity had already been chemically modified. By 1943, this process had become systemic. The German army, wittingly or not, used Eucadal as a means to push the limits of endurance across entire divisions. Officers believed they were observing the natural capacity of their soldiers, unaware that they were studying the effects of chemical enhancement. The boundary between medicine and performance testing had blurred entirely. In the end, the limits of human performance were not discovered, they were artificially constructed. Soldiers functioned as if limitless, moving through exhaustion, injury, and fear, sustained by a drug whose full consequences remained unknown. What commanders celebrated as resilience was, in truth, a fragile chemical suspension, a temporary victory purchased at the cost of bodies and minds whose breaking points would inevitably return to claim them. From Berlin to the smallest occupied town, the Reich excelled at crafting narratives. Posters depicted disciplined soldiers advancing through snow, artillery booms framed as triumphant crescendos, and pilots soaring above bombed-out cities like avenging angels. Every photograph, every official report, every newsreel was carefully curated to convey the image of a German army that was relentless, unflinching, and, above all, indomitable. The public saw invincibility. The soldiers themselves were expected to embody it. Yet beneath this carefully constructed image, chemical dependence quietly sustained the very qualities the propaganda celebrated. The Reich's propaganda machine rarely mentioned the toll of war, but it did not need to. The soldiers' outward performance was enough. A unit standing firm against Soviet advances in the freezing forests of Belarus, a battalion continuing an assault through a hail of artillery, a reconnaissance team returning with precise intelligence. Despite injuries, all of these feats reinforced the myth of German superhuman endurance. Commanders reported these successes up the chain, statistics were compiled, and newspapers circulated stories of bravery and discipline. What no one reported was the silent enabler behind many of these stories. Eucadal, propaganda, and chemical enhancement worked hand in hand. Medics distributed tablets to maintain performance. Officers encouraged their use to sustain operational effectiveness, and the public consumed images of soldiers seemingly unaffected by exhaustion, frost, or pain. When a man walked 10 kilometers through mud with a fractured foot, the newspaper printed a story of resolve. The tablets that masked his agony were invisible. When a unit held a trench against repeated attacks, the narrative highlighted courage. The opioids that dulled fear and pain were never acknowledged. The effect on morale, both civilian and military, was profound. Soldiers internalized the image they were expected to project. To falter meant shame. To admit weakness meant betrayal. Men who relied on pills to maintain composure and endurance were simultaneously performing heroism in the eyes of the state. The chemical support that allowed them to survive also bound them to the narrative of strength, making dependence almost invisible even to themselves. In command offices, propaganda reinforced chemical reliance. High-ranking officers pleased with reports of extraordinary endurance and battlefield composure, demanded continued performance. Orders emphasized stamina and bravery, and medics were tasked with ensuring that these expectations were met. When soldiers could not meet them naturally, chemical assistance became necessary, creating a feedback loop. The stronger the propaganda image, the more soldiers had to rely on drugs to live up to it. This narrative also extended to Hitler himself. Public and internal reporting emphasized the discipline, loyalty, and strength of the Wehrmacht as reflections of ideological purity and national destiny. In reality, many of these qualities were maintained artificially. The myth of unyielding strength masked the fragility beneath. Men pushed far beyond their natural limits. Bodies straining, minds dulled, dependence growing in silence. The more invincible the army appeared, the deeper the hidden crisis embedded itself. By the mid-war years, the propaganda of strength had become inseparable from chemical reinforcement. Each heroic story circulated in the Reich was, in part, a story of pills quietly sustaining soldiers who would have faltered without them. The public, officers, and soldiers alike consumed the myth without questioning its source. Eukodal, invisible on paper and unspoken in reports, became the silent partner in every narrative of courage, resilience, and endurance. In the end, the Reich succeeded in its portrayal. An army that seemed tireless and fearless, even as its true foundation, chemical dependency and human suffering, remained concealed from view, hidden behind the carefully constructed lens of propaganda. While the soldiers endured frost, mud, and relentless artillery on the front lines, the chemical crisis that sustained them quietly seeped into the fabric of German civilian life. Eukodal and other opioids were not limited to medical depots near combat zones. They circulated through hospitals, pharmacies, and private homes across the Reich. Families, unremarkable in appearance and unconnected to the war effort, found themselves enmeshed in the same chemical patterns that gripped the army dependents, growing silently, with consequences largely ignored. The civilian population had long relied on pharmaceuticals as a form of comfort and control. Morphine and opiates were commonplace in hospitals, often administered for everything from post-surgical pain to minor injuries. Housewives, mothers, and elderly patients were prescribed sedatives or analgesics liberally. In urban apartments, small bottles of tablets were stored in cabinets for convenience or precaution, often with little understanding of their potency or addictive potential. The war intensified this reliance. Stress, fear of bombings, and loss of loved ones increased consumption, while shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods heightened the desire for relief. Pharmacies across Germany faced growing demand. Chemists reported that sales of painkillers surged during raids or after news of casualties from the front. Requests for stronger medications became routine, sometimes justified under medical pretense, sometimes accepted without question. Doctors, themselves under pressure, often prescribed these drugs with minimal oversight. In the context of wartime anxiety, the threshold for intervention rose. A patient in distress received opioids more readily than they might have in peacetime, because the system prioritized coping and productivity over long-term consequences. The effects on families were profound yet subtle. Mothers who took Eukodal to manage anxiety or pain often became less emotionally reactive. Their interactions with children dulled, their awareness of stress muted. Fathers working in war support industries sometimes relied on sedatives to sustain long shifts in munitions factories, their endurance chemically maintained while fatigue built. Children, witnessing the quiet dependence of adults, absorbed the normalization of reliance on substances as a coping mechanism. In effect, the societal fabric was adapting to chemical support in much the same way the military did. This silent crisis mirrored the front in an eerie symmetry. Just as soldiers were kept functional through chemical masking of pain and fear, civilians used the same compounds to suppress anxiety, exhaustion, and emotional strain. The patterns of tolerance, withdrawal, and dependence observed on the battlefield, appeared in homes, workplaces, and hospitals, though they rarely drew attention. There was no reporting system for civilian dependence. Newspapers and radio broadcasts did not address the growing problem. Official acknowledgement was non-existent, leaving the crisis invisible, even as its reach expanded. The interconnection between front and home became apparent as supply lines moved Eucadal from factories to field depots, then into civilian distribution networks. Families inadvertently shared in the chemical infrastructure that was sustaining the army. Workers producing and transporting pharmaceuticals became complicit in the system, unaware that the same substances keeping soldiers marching also shaped the daily lives of those far from battle. By 1943, Germany was sustaining its war effort on multiple invisible fronts: guns, tanks, and bullets above ground, chemicals and dependency below. While the world observed the blitzkrieg and strategic maneuvers, a quieter, more insidious crisis unfolded in homes across the Reich. Men and women, soldiers and civilians alike, were caught in a shared reliance on substances meant to provide relief that was temporary, masking deeper exhaustion, fear, and vulnerability. The war did not only fracture Europe's geography, it fractured the human body, mind, and spirit, leaving dependence as the silent undercurrent binding both battlefield and home. Even at the apex of power, no one was immune to the chemical web silently underpinning the German war machine. Adolf Hitler, the Führer himself, operated within a personal medical sphere as insular and opaque as any frontline trench. Within his private quarters and the Reich Chancellery, a carefully managed medical team curated his health, administered his medications, and maintained the illusion of a vigorous, unwavering leader. Yet the Führer's own reliance on pharmaceuticals reflected the broader crisis that had taken hold of the army, a dependence that would shape decisions, distort judgment, and echo across the fronts. Hitler's medical bubble was meticulously constructed. He was attended by physicians who reported directly to him or to close aides, circumventing the usual chain of command. These doctors monitored his condition continuously, assessing everything from fatigue and digestive health to blood pressure and neurological responses. But they also administered a suite of substances designed to sustain him, stimulants to keep him alert, sedatives to maintain calm, and occasionally opioids or derivatives for pain or energy regulation. Each compound was calibrated, dosed with precision, and delivered in a manner meant to maximize performance while minimizing overt signs of dependence. The Führer's reliance was not widely known, though whispers circulated among inner circles. Staff members observed that Hitler's moods could swing dramatically euphoric, irritable, or withdrawn, often coinciding with his medication regimen. Advisors adapted to these patterns, timing briefings, decisions, and meetings to coincide with periods when he was chemically stabilized. The Empire's operations, therefore, were subtly influenced not only by ideology but by the rhythms of pharmacology. Hitler's personal dependency also created a microcosm of the ethical compromises that permeated the broader military structure. Within his bubble, the line between treatment and enhancement blurred. Medications were administered not solely to alleviate discomfort or illness, but to sustain his capacity to make decisions, receive reports, and issue directives. The Führer's medical team became gatekeepers, deciding what he needed to function and when, effectively controlling the chemical variables that could shape the course of the war. The broader implications were significant. Military strategies were often presented to Hitler in a controlled state of chemical alertness, ensuring compliance with operational priorities or enhancing his enthusiasm for particular plans. Advisors understood that timing and context could manipulate his decision-making subtly, leveraging periods when he was most lucid, or conversely, when his energy was artificially elevated. The Führer's physical and mental state, therefore, became a variable in the war itself. Yet, despite these precautions, the limitations of human physiology persisted. Hitler's reliance on pharmaceuticals did not render him infallible. Fatigue, stress, and the cognitive effects of prolonged use could distort judgment. Decisions made under chemical influence were insulated from natural warning mechanisms, hesitation, doubt, or emotional reflection. These distortions, invisible to the wider command structure, may have contributed to strategic miscalculations, delays, and inconsistencies in military directives. Hitler's medical bubble mirrored the broader chemical crisis consuming the Wehrmacht. Just as soldiers required Eukodal to endure pain, fatigue, and fear, the Führer relied on his own suite of drugs to sustain performance under the immense pressures of command. Both dependencies were hidden, both shaped behavior, and both were insulated from scrutiny. In the end, the Führer's personal reliance on medication underscores a critical truth. The chemical scaffolding that propped up the German army extended from the foxholes to the chancellery. Decisions, endurance, and appearances of strength were, in part, sustained by substances whose long-term consequences were ignored, hidden, or misunderstood. A silent framework upon which the Reich had built its war, and which would ultimately influence its unravelling. Winter on the Eastern Front was a relentless adversary, indifferent to strategy, discipline, or ideology. Snow blanketed the fields and forests in suffocating white, freezing rivers and mud alike, while temperatures dropped so low that exposed flesh could crack in minutes. Men huddled in trenches that offered little protection, their clothes soaked through with ice and sweat, their boots stiffened into unyielding blocks of frozen leather. In these conditions, the chemical dependence that had already taken root among soldiers became both a lifeline and a hidden threat, intensifying as the cold tested every limit of human endurance. The effects of Eukodal, which had allowed soldiers to push beyond natural fatigue, were magnified in winter. Pain was everywhere, frostbite biting fingers and toes, joints stiffened by cold, muscles sore from marching through drifts of ice and mud. Eukodal masked these sensations, enabling soldiers to continue moving despite physical breakdowns that would have incapacitated them under normal conditions. Medics, aware of the unique stressors winter imposed, distributed the drug with increasing regularity, adjusting doses based on anticipated hours of exposure and environmental severity. A soldier could walk kilometers on frostbitten feet, march through snow-laden forests, and hold a trench line for hours on end, all while his body silently sustained damage he could not yet feel. But winter revealed the other side of this chemical: reliance, the fragility hidden beneath apparent resilience. Soldiers who had grown dependent on Eukodal began to experience amplified withdrawal symptoms as supply lines faltered, convoys delayed by snowstorms, rail lines frozen or sabotaged, and ammunition transports prioritized over medical. Deliveries left men without access to their usual doses. Trembling, nauseated, and disoriented, they could no longer rely on their chemically induced steadiness. The very pill that had enabled survival now defined the boundaries of endurance. When it was unavailable, men faltered abruptly and catastrophically. Commanders often failed to recognize the warning signs. To the untrained eye, soldiers might simply appear fatigued or demoralized. Reports described slowed movements, unsteady hands, and decreased firing accuracy, but rarely identified the root cause as chemical dependency. In battalion briefings, officers assumed weather, terrain, or enemy pressure were to blame, unaware that the troops' performance had been artificially sustained and was now unraveling. Entire units experienced sudden collapses under conditions they had previously withstood with seeming ease, exposing the army to operational failures and higher casualties. The winter months also intensified psychological dependency. In addition to suppressing physical pain, Eukodal had dulled fear and anxiety. Soldiers accustomed to chemically moderated emotion found themselves trapped in new layers of dread when withdrawal or dose shortages occurred. Night watches in frozen trenches, normally survivable with endurance and training, became torturous. Hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme agitation emerged in men whose nervous systems were destabilized both by the cold and by the absence of chemical support. Medics worked frantically to stabilize them, often improvising with whatever remaining doses could be spared. By the end of the harsh winter, the army faced a stark reality. Survival had been chemically augmented at a massive cost. Soldiers emerged from frost-laden campaigns with injuries compounded by unfeeling marches, with nervous systems taxed beyond recognition, and with dependence that would not easily be shaken. Winter had not broken the army outright, but it had exposed the unsustainable underpinnings of its endurance. The season revealed a truth long ignored. In a war built on chemical support, nature's unyielding force, the freezing, punishing cold, could strip away the illusion of invincibility faster than any enemy artillery. The dependence that had carried soldiers through the fall was now both their protection and their vulnerability. A precarious lifeline suspended over the frozen front, ready to snap at the slightest disruption. Offensive operations demanded everything from a soldier's speed, alertness, precision, and endurance. Yet, as the Wehrmacht pressed eastward into the winter-locked forests of Russia, an insidious problem emerged that commanders could not plan for, train against, or account for on any map: withdrawal. Soldiers who had depended on Ukhodal for pain relief, energy, or psychological steadiness began experiencing its absence at the very moments when the army required peak performance. The result was a paradoxical collapse. Men expected to advance, break lines, and seize objectives found themselves incapacitated by the very substance that had enabled their previous feats. Field reports from mid-1942 detail strange patterns. Infantrymen who had completed forced marches and held defensive lines suddenly faltered during critical assaults. Their rifles slipped from unsteady hands. Their limbs shook uncontrollably. Some collapsed mid-march, unable to rise despite desperate efforts. Medics noted symptoms consistent with withdrawal: sweating, nausea, tremors, dizziness, and extreme anxiety. Officers recorded only the operational consequences: missed objectives, delayed maneuvers, and higher casualty rates, rarely connecting the dots to chemical dependency. The unpredictability of withdrawal created tactical chaos. Commanders relied on units that had, until then, appeared unbreakable. Men who had marched through snowdrifts for 48 hours without complaint suddenly required additional support. Medics improvised, providing emergency doses to stabilize soldiers, but supplies were finite, and the scale of dependency had long outstripped availability. In some cases, entire platoons had to halt operations until they could be resupplied, slowing advances and exposing flanks to counterattacks. Withdrawal also affected judgment and decision-making in real time. Soldiers experiencing chemical deficits often displayed impaired coordination and delayed reactions. A machine gunner, whose hands trembled, could not accurately track targets. A scout, experiencing nausea and dizziness, failed to relay reconnaissance reports promptly. Even minor lapses could have cascading effects, particularly during coordinated assaults or combined arms operations. The chemical crutch that had enabled precise execution of orders now betrayed them, introducing vulnerability where none had existed before. Psychologically, withdrawal compounded stress. Soldiers long accustomed to muted fear and dulled pain found themselves overwhelmed by sensations they had not felt in weeks or months. Every step into frozen forests, every explosion, every enemy engagement felt amplified. Hallucinations, paranoia, and panic attacks were reported in small, chaotic bursts, sometimes during the heat of combat, sometimes during brief respites between engagements. The soldiers' perception of the battlefield became unreliable, yet they were expected to maintain formation and continue advancing. Failure was not tolerated, and the consequences were immediate. Commanders, often unaware of the underlying cause, interpreted these episodes as fatigue, poor morale, or individual weakness. No higher-level directive acknowledged chemical dependence as a battlefield factor. Meanwhile, medics worked in overdrive, patching injuries, administering doses when possible, and attempting to stabilize men whose bodies had begun rebelling against the unnatural demands placed upon them. Each intervention was temporary. The cycle of dependency, withdrawal, and resupply became relentless. By late 1942, withdrawal during offensive operations had become a systemic issue. The Army's earlier successes, built on chemically enhanced endurance, began to unravel when soldiers' reserves ran dry. The very substance that had allowed rapid advances now created unpredictable liabilities, forcing commanders to contend not only with enemy resistance, but with the fragile, chemically dependent bodies of their own men. In the calculus of war, withdrawal was invisible, unrecorded, underestimated, and devastating. It demonstrated that no pill, no matter how potent, could replace human resilience, and that the chemical scaffolding supporting the Wehrmacht's offensives had a fatal vulnerability. It could fail when the army needed it most. Throughout the early and mid-stages of the war, German commanders prided themselves on discipline, organization, and meticulous planning. They believed that a rigid hierarchy, efficient logistics, and rigorous training could overcome almost any obstacle. Yet amidst the cold calculations of strategy and the obsessive management of men and materiel, one critical factor remained largely invisible: chemical dependency among the troops. The presence of Eucodal and other opioids was effectively a blind spot, one that distorted perceptions, created false confidence, and undermined the very foundations of command. Field reports, operational summaries, and after-action reviews routinely praised the endurance, resilience, and unwavering composure of soldiers. Units held positions far longer than anticipated. Assaults continued despite heavy casualties. Night marches proceeded with seeming inexhaustibility. To a commander reviewing the paperwork, the troops' performance appeared exemplary, proof of German efficiency and training. What the reports did not reveal, and what many officers did not recognize, was that these feats were often chemically enabled, with Eucodal masking exhaustion, fear, and pain. The blind spot was compounded by the hierarchical culture of the Wehrmacht. Officers rarely challenged reports from subordinate units. Medics, stretched thin and constrained by orders to keep soldiers operational, were reluctant to report signs of dependency or withdrawal. Observations that might have raised concern, trembling hands, hollow eyes, abnormal calm under fire, were dismissed as fatigue, stoicism, or exceptional discipline. Commanders, conditioned to trust documentation and appearances, had no framework to understand that performance could be artificially sustained. This lack of awareness had tangible consequences. Operational planning assumed that units could maintain a certain tempo, march a set distance, and hold positions indefinitely. Logistics anticipated attrition from combat or environmental exposure, but did not factor in the silent weakening caused by chemical dependence. When soldiers began showing signs of tolerance, withdrawal, or overuse, entire operations faltered. Units that were expected to advance or hold strategic points suddenly required reinforcement or delay. Commanders were confronted with failures. They could neither predict nor explain casualties that seemed disproportionate, fatigue that appeared out of step with conditions, and behavior that defied conventional training. The blind spot also influenced leadership psychology. Officers interpreted chemical-induced composure as courage or resolve, reinforcing confidence in soldiers' abilities. This perception shaped decisions at every level, from minor tactical adjustments to major offensive plans. Troops who relied on opioids to suppress fear and numb pain were seen as performing at human limits, when in reality their endurance was chemically augmented. Commanders' trust in the apparent strength of their men became a feedback loop, encouraging continued reliance on drugs while masking the risks. Even senior commanders in Berlin were not immune. Strategic assessments emphasized operational effectiveness, territorial gains, and unit cohesion, but the metrics used could not capture the subtle deterioration caused by dependency. Eucodal's role remained invisible, leaving planners to assume that success reflected purely physical and psychological resilience. Decisions made under these assumptions often overestimated the army's capabilities, exposing vulnerabilities that the Soviets and later the Allies exploited. By the latter half of the war, this blind spot had magnified its effects. Officers, convinced of their troops' natural strength, pushed men further, demanding sustained marches, prolonged assaults, and rapid redeployments. The result was a slow, creeping collapse in effectiveness, with the chemical scaffolding of Yukadal unable to compensate indefinitely. Commanders remained unaware that they had been relying on a fragile, invisible support system, one that masked human limitation until it could no longer do so. In the calculus of warfare, the Wehrmacht's greatest oversight was not enemy strategy, terrain, or logistics. It was the failure to perceive the invisible crisis beneath its own ranks. The chemical dependence of soldiers was the silent variable that skewed every decision, creating a dangerous illusion of unbreakable endurance, while the reality of human fragility festered beneath the surface. Elite formations, the Panzer divisions, Fallschirmjäger, and SS units were the crown jewels of the Wehrmacht. Their reputation for speed, precision, and near superhuman endurance was cultivated meticulously in propaganda, drills, and operational reports. Soldiers in these units were expected to perform beyond the capacity of ordinary infantry, maneuvering tanks under fire, executing airborne assaults, and sustaining rapid advances deep into enemy territory. Yet even among these elite units, the hidden crisis of chemical dependence had taken root, quietly undermining the very traits that made them appear exceptional. The demand for consistent, high-level performance drove the introduction and escalation of Yukadal use. A panzer crewman operating under freezing conditions, with gears stiff from ice and the engine belching smoke, could not afford hesitation. Pain, fatigue, or anxiety could mean the difference between survival and death. Medics routinely provided doses to suppress discomfort and maintain operational effectiveness. Over time, what began as occasional relief became regular, expected, and eventually essential. Even the most disciplined soldiers relied on the chemical crutch to meet the rigorous demands of elite warfare. Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers, were similarly affected. Precision, speed, and nerve were critical during airborne operations, where a single miscalculation could leave a soldier isolated behind enemy lines or killed on impact. Tablets were distributed to steady hands, calm nerves, and prolong alertness during prolonged engagements. Some soldiers reported feeling almost invincible after taking their doses, able to continue operating in conditions that would have immobilized unmedicated comrades. The apparent fearlessness and consistency reinforced the myth of elite invulnerability, masking the quiet, growing reliance on drugs. SS units, notorious for both discipline and brutality, were also deeply entwined with the chemical culture. Their operational doctrine emphasized aggression and efficiency, and commanders increasingly turned to Yukadal to sustain soldiers during extended campaigns in harsh conditions. Distribution was often informal, managed by trusted medics within the unit, and sometimes rationed based on perceived performance rather than medical necessity. Officers interpreted chemically maintained composure as exceptional discipline, further embedding reliance on the drug. The consequences of this dependence were multifaceted. Physiologically, repeated doses fostered tolerance, requiring higher amounts to achieve the same effect. Withdrawal, when supplies faltered or doses were delayed, produced tremors, nausea, and disorientation symptoms, particularly dangerous in high-stakes operations where precision and timing were critical. Psychologically, reliance on a chemical buffer dulled fear and moral hesitation, producing soldiers capable of acts of extraordinary violence with muted emotional response. Yet this dependency remained largely invisible to higher command. Reports emphasized speed, efficiency, and operational success, while ignoring the underlying human cost. The myth of elite invincibility was reinforced by the very drugs that sustained it, creating a feedback loop in which units were pushed further, doses increased, and dependence deepened, all under the guise of exceptionalism. By mid-war, the hidden reliance among elite units had become systemic. Soldiers who appeared unstoppable on paper were, in reality, chemically stabilized, their endurance artificially sustained, and their vulnerability masked until the moment when drugs were unavailable. What the Reich hailed as the superhuman quality of these units was, in truth, a precarious balance, a silent dependency threatening to unravel the very formations it was meant to sustain. The physical strain of war is visible: frostbitten limbs, blisters, blood, and exhaustion. Yet, the psychological strain, amplified by chemical dependence, was far less apparent and far more insidious. Eucodal and other opioids allowed soldiers to function beyond their natural limits, dulling pain, anxiety, and fear. But in doing so, they suppressed the mind's natural warning signals, creating a dangerous disconnection between action and consequence. Over weeks and months, this chemical masking took a profound toll on cognition, emotion, and perception, leaving soldiers increasingly detached from reality. Soldiers described a strange dissociation. They moved, fired, and obeyed orders, yet a part of them felt removed, as though they were observing themselves from outside their bodies. The numbing effect of opioids silenced the body's natural panic response and dulled the emotional resonance of fear, grief, and moral hesitation. For men standing ankle-deep in mud, under relentless artillery fire, the chemical fog insulated them from terror, but at the cost of self-awareness. Soldiers who should have panicked could instead act with eerie calm, making calculated decisions even as their surroundings erupted in chaos. Yet, this artificial composure carried unintended consequences. Fear, normally a vital survival mechanism, was suppressed until the drug's effect waned. Once the chemical influence faded, men experienced delayed terror, sudden anxiety, and extreme emotional volatility. A soldier who had advanced confidently during an assault might collapse afterward into panic or despair. Moments of chemical clarity became unpredictable, leaving soldiers vulnerable to misjudgments, delayed reactions, or even hallucinations. The mind, habituated to constant suppression, struggled to interpret stimuli accurately without the familiar chemical crutch. Withdrawal exacerbated these effects. Soldiers deprived of their usual doses experienced tremors, nausea, agitation, and insomnia. Even in relatively safe positions, men could not rest, their minds racing and bodies shaking. Panic attacks in trenches were common. Hallucinations of enemy movements or imagined threats caused confusion and sometimes friendly fire incidents. Units that had appeared unshakable during operations suddenly faltered, not because of enemy action, but because of the unseen psychological toll of dependence. The emotional impact extended beyond immediate operations. Soldiers struggled with guilt, shame, and moral dissonance. Actions performed under chemical influence, killing, destroying, or witnessing atrocity often returned in distorted recollections. They remembered the facts but not the emotional engagement, creating a hollowed sense of experience. Medics and officers noted unusual detachment, but few understood its origin. Some soldiers began seeking the drugs not for physical relief, but to regain that numbed composure, reinforcing a dangerous psychological cycle. Commanders misinterpreted this quiet crisis as discipline, stoicism, or toughness. Reports emphasized efficiency and composure, reinforcing the illusion that chemical reliance was simply enhancing natural endurance. Yet the truth was more complicated. What appeared as resilience was often instability in disguise, a fragile equilibrium maintained by chemical interference in natural, emotional, and cognitive processes. By mid-war, the psychological toll of chemical reliance was profound. Soldiers became dependent not just physically, but mentally. Their espina, decision-making, emotional resilience, and moral engagement intertwined with the substances sustaining them. Eucodal had created an army capable of extraordinary feats, but at the cost of the very humanity that gave those feats meaning. The war had become a crucible not only of bodies but of minds, each tablet silently reshaping the men who depended upon it. The chemical dependence that gripped the Wehrmacht did not exist in isolation. While soldiers relied on opioids to endure the extremes of combat, the ripple effects of this dependence often spilled into the lives of civilians trapped in occupied territories. Eucodal and similar substances influenced not only the behavior of soldiers in the field, but also the conduct of units as they moved through towns, villages, and cities, altering interactions with non-combatants and amplifying the war's human cost. Civilians frequently bore witness to soldiers whose composure seemed unnatural. Infantrymen who had swallowed doses before entering towns appeared eerily calm in the face of destruction, rubble, and terrified populations. They moved with deliberate precision, carrying out orders without hesitation or moral reflection. Acts that might have caused hesitation in a naturally alert soldier, the confiscation of food, the rounding up of civilians, the enforcement of curfews were executed with mechanical detachment. The chemical suppression of fear and anxiety dulled empathy, creating a form of operational efficiency at the expense of humanity. Reports from occupied villages reveal a disturbing pattern. Soldiers under the influence of opioids often engaged in acts of coercion, intimidation, and violence that exceeded what would have been expected from standard military discipline. While officers may have interpreted these behaviors as discipline or control, the underlying reality was a drug-modulated willingness to push further, suppress hesitation, and act without the psychological checks that fear and empathy normally provide. Civilians observed this composure with confusion and terror. Their compliance was often enforced not just through threat, but through the unsettling calmness of chemically sustained soldiers. In areas where resistance or partisan activity was suspected, the presence of chemically enhanced troops amplified the severity of reprisals. Soldiers could march into villages with minimal hesitation, enforce harsh measures, and carry out searches and detentions with a precision that had little to do with individual willpower and more to do with pharmacologically muted caution. Fear, both for themselves and for civilians, was dulled. Pain, exhaustion, and moral restraint had been chemically suppressed. The result was a form of efficiency that magnified the potential for collateral damage. Civilian health and survival were also indirectly affected. Supply requisitions that included medical drugs for soldiers often competed with limited resources for hospitals and local pharmacies. Towns already strained by occupation, food shortages, and bombing raids faced the additional pressure of supplying or accommodating the needs of an army chemically propped up to endure extremes. Eucodal, while sustaining soldiers' performance, contributed to the broader environment of scarcity and suffering. Children, elderly, and families saw these effects daily. They observed men who appeared invincible standing through artillery fire, marching miles without fatigue, and executing orders with unnerving calm. Yet, behind the veneer of strength lay dependency, a fragile control maintained by chemicals. The apparent fearlessness of soldiers increased the sense of helplessness among civilians, reinforcing the perception that the occupiers were beyond ordinary human limits. By the end of 1943, the chemical crisis of the Wehrmacht had become more than a military issue. It shaped how entire communities experienced occupation, magnifying the psychological terror of war. Soldiers' opioid dependence was invisible in operational reports, yet its effects were tangible on the ground. Enhanced aggression, muted hesitation, and a chilling capacity to inflict suffering without moral restraint. In the broader calculus of war, the hidden crisis among soldiers had transformed into a direct factor in the suffering of those who lived under the shadow of the German army. The backbone of chemical dependence within the Wehrmacht was not solely the soldiers or the supply lines. It rested heavily on the shoulders of the medical staff, doctors, nurses, and medics who, willingly or reluctantly, became complicit in sustaining the crisis. Trained to preserve life, They found themselves in an environment where the survival of the army often outweighed the well-being of individual soldiers. Their role was transformed, subtly at first, into one of enabler, providing the very substances that allowed the army to function at the edge of human capability, even as it silently eroded the bodies and minds of the men they treated. At the front, medics faced impossible choices daily. A wounded soldier shivering in the snow, frostbitten and exhausted, begged for a dose to suppress pain and numb his fear. Without the chemical aid, he might be unable to continue the march, compromising the unit. With it, he could perform beyond natural limits, his suffering temporarily silenced. Each decision carried moral weight, the immediate operational benefit versus the long-term physiological and psychological damage. In the relentless logic of war, the former repeatedly outweighed the latter. Field doctors developed informal guidelines, unspoken rules designed to maintain troop functionality while attempting to minimize harm. But the sheer scale of demand often rendered these guidelines irrelevant. Units suffering heavy casualties, stretched supply, lines, and near-constant engagement required more doses than any standard could ethically justify. The staff found themselves distributing Eucodal and other opioids not merely to treat injuries, but to suppress exhaustion, anxiety, and fear, turning medicine into a tool of performance rather than care. Hospital trains, field stations, and mobile dispensaries became hubs of both treatment and compulsion. Medical personnel kept careful notes on injuries and dosages, but rarely on the growing patterns of dependency. The focus was operational. If a battalion could continue moving, if an assault could proceed without hesitation, the medic's duty was fulfilled. Whether the men were chemically dependent, tolerant, or in early withdrawal, rarely reached the level of official concern. In practice, the medical staff were complicit, maintaining a system in which chemical intervention substituted for natural resilience. The hierarchy reinforced complicity. Officers expected efficiency, discipline, and obedience. Medics were pressured to supply the means for soldiers to meet these demands. Requests for additional doses were rarely questioned. Refusal could endanger operational effectiveness or provoke backlash from commanders. The subtle coercion of authority, combined with the practical necessity of sustaining units in harsh conditions, transformed medics into enforcers of chemical compliance, whether they wanted the role or not. Compounding the problem, medical staff themselves often became dependent, taking the same drugs they dispensed to maintain focus during endless shifts, frigid nights, and unrelenting casualty influxes. A medic who administered pills for 12 hours a day under artillery fire might rely on stimulants or sedatives to endure the stress, blurring the line between professional responsibility and personal survival. This shared dependence further normalized chemical reliance within the military medical community. By 1943, complicity was systemic. Doctors and medics no longer simply treated injuries. They managed endurance, morale, and operational performance through chemical means. Their expertise, intended to preserve life, had been repurposed to extend it artificially for the Army's broader objectives. The Wehrmacht's survival depended not only on bullets, tanks, and orders, but on the ethical compromises of those sworn to heal. The consequence was profound. The very hands meant to safeguard soldiers' health became instruments of dependency, embedding the chemical crisis deeper into the Army's structure and ensuring that its silent toll would persist long after the war had moved on. In the Wehrmacht, discipline was sacrosanct. Orders were obeyed without question, reports were filed meticulously, and deviations from protocol were punished swiftly. Yet, when it came to the escalating chemical dependence of soldiers, many officers deliberately chose to look away. It was not negligence born of ignorance, but a calculated tolerance, an understanding that addressing the problem might compromise operational effectiveness, morale, or the image of invincibility that the Army sought to project. The signs of dependence were visible to any officer who observed his troops closely. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, shivering from withdrawal, hands trembling, lips dry, movements unsteady. Medics delivered pills at increasing frequency, occasionally rationing what little they had left. Some men became emotionally flat, responding to orders without hesitation but showing little comprehension of risk or consequence. Others displayed aggressive or reckless behaviors when dosages fluctuated. To the trained eye, these were unmistakable symptoms of chemical reliance. Yet officers routinely interpreted them differently, as fatigue, stoicism, or extraordinary resolve. Operational imperatives often dictated this deliberate blindness. Commanders faced situations where units had to maintain pace under impossible conditions. Forced marches in freezing weather, extended night assaults, or rapid redeployment across hundreds of kilometers. Any hesitation, complaint, or refusal could compromise the mission, exposing flanks, delaying offensives, or increasing casualties. In such circumstances, chemical support, even if it bred dependence, became a pragmatic solution. Soldiers functioning artificially were better than soldiers who faltered. Officers also relied on appearance. A soldier who marched without complaint, fired his weapon steadily, and obeyed orders precisely created an illusion of discipline and capability. The means by which this was achieved, chemical assistance, was irrelevant in their calculations. Commanders were concerned with results, not mechanisms. A unit that performed well reinforced the reputation of its leadership, boosting the career of its officers and sustaining confidence within higher command. In this sense, overlooking chemical dependence was an expedient tool of governance. The culture of denial extended beyond tactical considerations. Within divisions, officers often compared the endurance of units as a mark of excellence. Those able to sustain prolonged operations were praised, decorated, and publicized. Yet these units frequently had higher rates of opioid use. The very successes celebrated in dispatches were, in part, chemically engineered. By ignoring the underlying dependency, officers perpetuated a system in which performance metrics misrepresented human capacity. There were moments of private acknowledgement. Some officers, aware of the risks, attempted subtle interventions limiting access to medics, rationing doses, or assigning additional rest periods. However, these measures were often overridden by operational necessity or pressure from higher command. The Army's culture rewarded endurance and results, not ethical restraint or concern for long-term health. By 1943, the trend had solidified. Chemical reliance was so widespread that addressing it openly would have risked both morale and efficiency. Officers' tacit acceptance ensured continuity of operations, but came at the expense of the soldiers' long-term well-being. They became enablers, not through malice, but through calculated necessity, maintaining a fragile balance in which the Army's immediate objectives justified the hidden cost. In this way, officers turned a blind eye, embedding chemical dependence deeper into the structure of the Wehrmacht. The soldiers performed, the units moved, and battles continued, all while the silent crisis worsened, hidden beneath the facade of discipline, obedience, and extraordinary resilience. The very structure of command had adapted to dependence, making it invisible, unspoken, and indispensable. The collapse of the Wehrmacht was not always loud. It was not always marked by catastrophic battles, encirclements, or explosions that could be documented in photographs. Many of its failures were silent, hidden in the trembling hands, hollowed eyes, and chemically muted judgment of its own soldiers. By 1944, the cumulative effects of opioid dependence, compounded by fatigue, harsh winters, and relentless combat, began to manifest in ways that officers and planners could neither anticipate nor fully understand. The very foundation of the Army, artificially sustained for years, was cracking under the weight of unseen vulnerabilities. Units that had once been celebrated for endurance began faltering unexpectedly. A panzer company in Ukraine, praised for rapid advances, stalled because crews could not coordinate under the stress of mechanical failures and withdrawal-induced tremors. Infantry battalions in the Ardennes showed remarkable courage in assaults only to collapse when the artificial composure provided by Eukodal wore off. Men who had marched through forests, across rivers, and over frozen plains with near superhuman steadiness suddenly stumbled, misfired, or froze under enemy fire. Commanders, accustomed to measuring performance without considering chemical influence, interpreted these failures as fatigue, incompetence, or the effect of the enemy's superior strategy. The unpredictability of withdrawal exacerbated the chaos. Soldiers reliant on opioids displayed abrupt swings in behavior, moments of mechanical precision followed by sudden lapses, tremors, nausea, or disorientation. In one case, a platoon advancing during a winter offensive found 3 of its men unable to fire their rifles because their hands shook uncontrollably. A medic, with only a limited supply of Eukodal, could stabilize one, but not all. The rest were left to falter, compromising the mission and endangering comrades. Such incidents became increasingly common as supply lines failed and doses became irregular. Psychologically, the collapse was just as severe. Soldiers, long accustomed to suppressed fear and dulled pain, found themselves confronting both simultaneously when the chemical shield diminished. Hallucinations, panic attacks, and irrational aggression emerged in small pockets, spreading confusion through units that were expected to act in synchrony. Officers struggled to maintain order. Medics worked desperately to restore balance, but the system dependent on artificially sustained performance had no mechanism to absorb such instability. Even strategic operations were affected. Divisions that appeared capable of sustained offensives failed to execute maneuvers as planned. Retreats became disorderly as soldiers broke formation during withdrawal symptoms. Reconnaissance reports were delayed, misreported, or incomplete due to impaired judgment. Higher command, unaware of the chemical underpinning, commons of these units, interpreted these failures as logistical errors, miscommunication, or a temporary decline in morale, failing to grasp that the collapse was rooted in a widespread, invisible dependency. The cumulative effect was systemic. The Army's previously calculated margins for endurance, morale, and operational capability had been artificially inflated by Eukodal. When the drug's influence fluctuated, whether due to supply shortages, tolerance, or withdrawal, the fragile equilibrium that commanders relied upon dissolved. Units once deemed unbreakable were suddenly vulnerable not to overwhelming firepower, but to the physiological and psychological consequences of years spent relying on chemical support. By the time historians would later reconstruct these operations, the scale of the silent collapse became evident. An army performing far beyond natural limits for years, sustained artificially by drugs, unraveling quietly under the pressure of the same mechanisms that had once enabled it. The unseen collapse was a testament to human fragility, chemical dependence, and the dangerous illusion of strength maintained through substances, unseen and unmeasured, until the moment it could no longer hold. By the final years of the war, the chemical crisis that had silently coursed through the German army had left a profound and lasting imprint. Eukodal, once introduced as a means to relieve pain and sustain endurance, had evolved into a structural component of military operations, shaping not only the performance of soldiers but the decisions of commanders, the strategies of officers, and even the culture of obedience that defined the Wehrmacht. Its presence was invisible in official records, unacknowledged in reports, yet it was fundamental to both the army's temporary successes and its eventual unraveling. Survivors would later describe a lingering awareness of the cost. Men who had relied on opioids for months, even years, found themselves physically and psychologically altered. Muscles and joints, strained beyond natural limits, bore the marks of forced endurance. Nervous systems, habituated to chemical suppression, trembled and shook when doses were withheld. Even after the war, veterans experienced prolonged withdrawal effects, insomnia, anxiety, and emotional flatness, a reminder that the war had left not just wounds on the body, but scars on the mind. Commanders, too, carried the legacy of chemical reliance. Many had become accustomed to units that could perform beyond natural limits, to battalions seemingly impervious to fatigue and fear. Post-war assessments revealed that much of this exceptional performance had been chemically mediated. Officers who had relied on artificially stabilized troops had inadvertently misjudged the limits of human endurance. Strategies developed under the illusion of unbreakable units often failed when applied to soldiers without chemical support. The operational lessons of the war were therefore colored by an invisible variable: the presence of drugs that masked the very vulnerabilities commanders sought to understand. The ethical implications were equally profound. Medics and field doctors who had participated in the distribution of opioids found themselves grappling with their role in the crisis. Decisions that had seemed necessary to maintain operational effectiveness now appeared morally ambiguous, if not outright complicit. They had, in effect, converted medical expertise into a mechanism of dependence, blurring the line between care and control. The war had created a scenario where ethics were subordinated to expedience, leaving a lasting dilemma for the medical professionals who survived. Civilian populations, indirectly touched by the chemical culture of the military, also felt its aftershocks. Soldiers returning home carried dependence with them, influencing families and communities. The normalization of chemical reliance, reinforced during occupation and service, seeped into post-war society in subtle ways. Pharmacies, hospitals, and households that had adapted to widespread pharmaceutical use now faced veterans whose bodies and minds were irrevocably altered by prolonged exposure to opioids. Strategically, the legacy of dependence revealed the limits of military power when built on artificial scaffolding. The temporary boosts in endurance and performance enabled rapid advances and bold maneuvers, but the fragility underlying these gains ultimately contributed to the Army's operational failures. Units that seemed invincible faltered, retreats became chaotic, and morale broke in ways that could not be remedied by discipline alone. In the end, the chemical crisis of the Wehrmacht left a dual legacy: extraordinary feats achieved under artificial endurance and human costs that would endure for decades. Soldiers' bodies were broken, their minds unsettled, and commanders' understanding of human limits skewed. WWII had silently shaped the war, sustaining the illusion of strength even as it hollowed out the very men and structures upon which Germany relied. The opioid that once promised endurance became a defining, invisible force, a legacy of dependence that would outlive the conflict, haunting memory, history, and the understanding of what it truly cost to fight the war.